Story 1. I overheard my girlfriend doubting our love, walked out and rebuilt my life from scratch. Hey there, Reddit. It's been a whirlwind of emotions these past few weeks, and honestly, I don't even know what to do with myself anymore. My name's Matt. I'm 32 years old, and up until recently I thought I had my life, and my love life, completely figured out. Spoiler alert, I didn't. Not even close. For the past 2 years, I'd been dating Emily. To me, she was everything. Smart, beautiful, funny, and most importantly, she made me feel like I was the luckiest guy in the world. Or so I thought. The way we met still feels like something out of a cheesy Hallmark movie. It was at this Christmas party hosted by my high school buddy Jake. Now, Jake and I go way back. He's one of those friends you can't help but admire. He's got this big, boisterous personality and always knows how to bring people together. Emily worked for Jake at his marketing firm, and that night she was the life of the party. I still remember seeing her for the first time. She was standing by the Christmas tree, laughing with a group of people, holding one of those red plastic cups you see at every house party. Jake, being the social butterfly he is, dragged me over to meet her. I wasn't really in the mood for socializing. I just had a hell of a week at work. But Jake wouldn't take no for an answer. "Matt, this is Emily," he said, grinning ear to ear. "Emily, meet Matt. He's not as boring as he looks." I was caught off guard, but Emily just laughed and extended her hand. "Hi, Matt. Don't worry, I won't hold your boring looks against you." We hit it off immediately. Emily had this way of making you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room. She laughed at my dumb jokes, asked about my hobbies, and seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. By the end of the night, I had her number and a grin on my face that I couldn't wipe off. It felt like one of those meant-to-be moments you only read about. A couple of weeks later, we went on our first date. I decided to keep it simple. Burgers at a little diner I loved, followed by a walk in the park. To my surprise, Emily was completely on board. No complaints about it being too low-key or casual. In fact, she seemed to love it. We spent hours talking about everything and nothing. Our childhoods, favorite movies, dream vacations. By the time I dropped her off that night, I was hooked. Emily wasn't just another pretty face. She was someone I could see myself building a life with. Fast forward a few months, and we were officially a couple. Life felt like it was falling into place. I'd finally found someone who got me, who laughed at my jokes and didn't roll their eyes when I talked about my nerdy hobbies like hiking obscure trails or experimenting with home brewing. A year later, we took the next big step, moving in together. We found a cozy little house just outside the city, a place where we could split rent and start building our future. Emily even joked about how we were living in chapter 1 of our love story. And for a while, it really did feel like a love story. We settled into a comfortable routine, splitting chores and binging shows together on the weekends. I wasn't in a rush to propose. I've always been more of a let's enjoy the moment kind of guy, but the thought was definitely there. Emily felt like my person, my forever, or at least that's what I told myself. Looking back, there were red flags I ignored, starting with her younger sister Chloe. Chloe and Emily couldn't have been more different. While Emily was warm and easygoing, Chloe was sharp and, frankly, a little cold. From the moment I met her, I could tell she didn't like me. It wasn't like she was outright rude, but she had this way of making comments that cut just deep enough to sting. Take, for instance, one of the first family dinners I attended. We were all sitting around the table when Chloe smirked and said, "Wow, Emily, you really went for the low-maintenance look, huh?" Everyone laughed it off, but it was clear she was taking a jab at me. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe she was just being protective of her sister. But the digs never stopped. If I mentioned something I was passionate about, like a recent hike Emily and I went on, Chloe would roll her eyes and say something like, "Wow, how thrilling. I'm sure the trees were fascinating." It wasn't just the comments, though. Chloe had a habit of bringing up Emily's exes at the worst times. Once, she mentioned how Emily and her ex-boyfriend Mark had gone on this amazing trip to Cancun. "That must have been such a fun time for you guys," she said, smiling sweetly at Emily. It felt like she was constantly trying to remind me that Emily could do better, that I wasn't good enough. I brought it up to Emily a few times, asking why Chloe seemed to have it out for me. She'd just laugh it off and say, "That's just Chloe. She's like that with everyone." But it didn't feel that way. She was perfectly nice to everyone else, just not me. Still, I sucked it up for Emily's sake. I figured every family has its quirks, right? Despite Chloe's attitude, my relationship with Emily kept moving forward. This year, Jake was throwing another Christmas party, and it felt like the perfect place to propose. After all, it was where our story began. I spent weeks planning everything, picked out the perfect ring, rehearsed what I'd say, even coordinated with Jake to make sure the moment would be special. The ring was a piece of art. It took me weeks to find something that felt just right. I wanted something that would take Emily's breath away but also fit her personality. Simple, elegant, and timeless. I couldn't wait to see the look on her face when I got down on one knee. I imagined her eyes lighting up, the way her lips would curl into that shy smile she always gave when she was genuinely happy. I thought about how we'd tell the story to our future kids, how we'd laugh about the journey that brought us to that moment. But life has a funny way of pulling the rug out from under you. A month ago, life seemed as stable as ever. I was deep into planning the Christmas proposal. Every detail was falling into place, and I was convinced I was heading toward a picture-perfect future. But then, out of nowhere, everything started to unravel. It's like the universe was sitting on the sidelines, waiting for the perfect moment to throw me off course. It all began with a fishing trip. The guys and I had been talking about it for weeks, and I was looking forward to a weekend off the grid. Our go-to spot was a quiet lake a few hours from the city, tucked away from the chaos of everyday life. It's the kind of place where you can just unwind. No cell service, no emails, no distractions. Just nature, a couple of coolers of beer, and good company. I needed this trip more than I realized. Between work stress, Chloe's constant jabs, and the pressure of planning the perfect proposal, I felt like I hadn't had a moment to breathe in ages. Emily wasn't thrilled about the trip, though. I could tell from the moment I mentioned it. "A whole weekend?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "What if something happens? What if I need you?" "You'll be fine, Em," I reassured her, trying to keep things light. "It's just 2 days. Besides, you've got Chloe if anything comes up, right?" Her expression softened slightly, but there was still a flicker of unease in her eyes. "Yeah, I guess," she murmured, but something about the way she said it didn't sit right with me. Looking back now, I wonder if she was trying to tell me something, if she knew something I didn't. At the time, though, I brushed it off. I figured she was just being clingy, not wanting to spend the weekend alone. The weekend finally came, and I hit the road with the guys early Saturday morning. The trip was everything I needed and more. We spent the days fishing, laughing over old stories, and just soaking up the peace and quiet. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't thinking about work or wedding plans. I wasn't worrying about whether Chloe would take another jab at me during the next family dinner. It was just me, my friends, and the simplicity of the outdoors. By the time Sunday evening rolled around, I felt recharged. I pulled into the driveway late that night, expecting to find Emily asleep or maybe curled up on the couch with one of her favorite rom-coms. But as I stepped inside, something felt off. The living room light was on, and there was an empty wine glass on the coffee table. Emily wasn't in bed either. Instead, I found her sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. "Hey," I said, dropping my duffel bag by the door, "you didn't have to wait up." She looked up at me, her expression unreadable. "How was the trip?" she asked, her tone casual but distant. "It was good," I replied, forcing a smile. "Caught a few fish, told some terrible jokes, the usual." "That's nice," she said, but her voice was flat. There was no warmth, no excitement. I asked if everything was okay, and she brushed it off, saying she was just tired. I didn't press her. I figured she'd had a long weekend, too, and we'd talk more in the morning. But that uneasy feeling lingered. Over the next few days, things only got stranger. Emily seemed distracted, glued to her phone more than usual. She started going out for quick errands at odd hours, and when I asked her about it, she'd give vague answers. "Just needed to pick something up," she'd say, or "Chloe wanted to grab coffee." It didn't make sense. Chloe lived on the other side of town, and they weren't exactly the kind of sisters who dropped everything to hang out. Still, I wanted to trust her. I had to. This was Emily, the woman I was planning to marry. What else could I do? Then, everything came crashing down. It was a Thursday evening. I'd come home early from work, planning to surprise Emily with dinner. I'd picked up her favorite Thai takeout and even stopped by the bakery she loved to grab those mini tarts she couldn't resist. As I walked up to the house, I heard voices coming from inside, Emily's along with someone else's, a man's. I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. "You're too much," Emily said, her laughter ringing out like a dagger to my chest. "He's so clueless. He has no idea." My stomach dropped. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My first instinct was to burst in and demand an explanation, but something held me back. Instead, I stood there, rooted to the spot as the conversation continued. "I mean, he's sweet," Emily went on, her tone light and playful. "But he's just not exciting, you know? It's like he's trying so hard to be perfect, and it's suffocating. Sometimes I just need something different." The other person laughed, a low, smug chuckle that made my blood boil. "Well, you've got options," he said. "You're too good for him anyway." I couldn't listen anymore. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I turned and walked away, leaving the takeout bag on the porch. I don't even remember getting into my car or driving off. All I know is that I ended up at Jake's place, my mind racing with questions I didn't want the answers to. Jake opened the door, his face lighting up when he saw me. "Matt, what's up, man?" he said, stepping aside to let me in. I couldn't even speak. I just walked past him, collapsed onto his couch, and stared at the floor. "It's Emily," I finally managed to say. I think she's cheating on me." Jake's expression shifted immediately. "What? Are you serious? What happened?" I told him everything. The voices, the conversation, the gut-wrenching realization that the woman I thought I'd spend my life with might not be who I thought she was. Jake listened quietly, his brow furrowed in concern. When I finished, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "Matt," he said, his voice steady, "you need to talk to her, find out what's really going on." But I wasn't ready for that, not yet. I spent the night at Jake's, lying awake on his couch, staring at the ceiling. My mind replayed everything I'd heard, twisting and turning every word until they felt like knives stabbing deeper into my chest. I wanted answers, but I didn't know if I was ready to face them. What if the truth was even worse than what I already knew? What if everything I thought I had with Emily was a lie? The night I spent at Jake's was one of the longest in my life. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Emily's laughter echoing in my head, those cruel words she'd said as if they were some kind of joke. "He's so clueless." It felt like my chest was caving in, suffocating under the weight of everything I thought I knew about us, about her. Jake did his best to be supportive. He's one of those friends who's always been good at saying the right thing when it matters most. But even he struggled to find the right words this time. He made coffee in the morning, and just sat with me in silence for a while, letting me process in my own time. Finally, he broke the quiet. "What's your plan, man? Are you going to talk to her?" he asked, his voice gentle but probing. I stared into my coffee mug, watching the steam curl into the air like the chaos in my mind. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "What's the point? If she's already checked out of the relationship, what good is talking going to do?" "You don't know for sure, Matt," Jake said carefully. "I mean, yeah, it sounds bad, worse than bad, but you didn't see anything. You heard a conversation. Maybe there's more to it." "More to it!" I snapped, my frustration boiling over. "She said I'm suffocating, that I'm not exciting enough. What the hell am I supposed to do with that?" Jake held up his hands in defense. "Look, I'm just saying, man, if you're gonna end things, at least do it knowing the full story. Don't leave room for what-ifs. Trust me, you don't want to carry that with you." His words stuck with me as I drove home later that morning. I didn't know if I was ready to confront Emily, but Jake was right. I couldn't move on without answers. I needed to hear her side of the story, even if it hurt, even if it confirmed my worst fears. When I walked into the house, Emily was in the kitchen pouring herself a cup of coffee. She looked up as I stepped through the door, and for a moment, relief flickered across her face. But then she saw the look on mine, and her expression changed, confusion mixed with unease. "Hey," she said, setting her mug down. "Where were you? I was worried." "Were you?" I asked sharply, my voice colder than I intended. Her brow furrowed, and I saw her walls go up immediately. This wasn't going to be an easy conversation. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, crossing her arms. "What's going on, Matt?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I came home early last night," I began, watching her carefully. Her face didn't give much away, but there was a flicker of something, fear maybe, in her eyes. "I heard you talking to someone." Her eyes widened slightly, but she recovered quickly, forcing a laugh. "Oh, that," she said, brushing it off. "That was just Chloe. We were on the phone, catching up." "Don't lie to me, Emily," I said, my voice firm. "It wasn't Chloe. I know what I heard." She stared at me for a moment, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then she sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Okay, fine," she admitted. "It wasn't Chloe. It was a friend. But you're blowing this way out of proportion, Matt. We were just talking, that's all." "Just talking?" I repeated, my anger bubbling to the surface. "You said I was suffocating you, that you needed something different. Is that just talking?" Emily hesitated, and for the first time I saw real regret in her eyes. She took a step closer, her voice softening. "Matt, I didn't mean it like that," she said. "I was venting, okay? Everyone gets frustrated sometimes. It doesn't mean I don't love you." "Do you?" I asked, my voice cracking, because it doesn't feel like it, not after what I heard. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at her hands, twisting the ring I'd given her between her fingers. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know." Those 3 words hit me harder than anything else she could have said. I don't know. It was like everything we'd built together was crumbling beneath my feet. "What does that mean, Emily?" I demanded, my voice rising. "You don't know if you love me? You don't know if you want to be with me? What are we even doing here?" "I don't know, Matt," she shouted back, her frustration spilling over. "I don't know how I feel anymore. Things have been different lately. You've been so focused on work, on this picture-perfect future you're trying to create, and I feel like I'm just along for the ride, like I don't even have a say in my own life." I stared at her, stunned. "What are you talking about? Everything I've been doing for us, for our future." "But what if I don't want that future?" she said, her voice breaking. "What if I'm not ready to settle down? What if I need more time to figure out who I am before I commit to forever?" Her words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong. But deep down, a part of me understood what she was saying. I just didn't want to admit it. "I thought we were building something together," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I thought we were on the same page." "So did I," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. But somewhere along the way, I started to feel trapped, like I was losing myself. I didn't know how to tell you. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. The love I thought we shared now felt like a distant memory, replaced by a chasm of doubt and uncertainty. I wanted to reach out to her, to hold her and tell her we could fix this. But deep down, I wasn't sure if that was true anymore. "I need some time," she said finally, wiping her eyes, "to figure things out, to figure out what I want." I nodded even though my heart was breaking. "Take all the time you need." And with that, I turned and walked out of the house. I didn't know where I was going or what the future held, but one thing was clear. My life would never be the same again. Walking out of that house felt like stepping into a void. The home we'd built together, the life we'd shared, it all felt meaningless now. I didn't have a plan or even a destination in mind. All I knew was that I couldn't be there anymore. I got into my car and just drove, letting the road take me wherever it wanted. The first place I ended up was a diner on the edge of town, one of those 24-hour spots with sticky booths and bottomless coffee. It was nearly empty, just a couple of truckers at the counter and an older waitress who looked like she'd seen it all. I ordered a coffee and sat there for what felt like hours, staring at my reflection in the window. I didn't even recognize the guy looking back at me. My phone buzzed at least 3 times while I sat there, but I ignored it. I didn't want to talk to anyone, not Jake, not Emily, not even myself. All I wanted was silence, but my mind wouldn't give it to me. It kept replaying everything she'd said, every word like a shard of glass cutting deeper. I don't know. That's what haunted me the most. How could she not know? After everything we'd been through, after all the plans we'd made. How could she not know if she loved me? Eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I checked my phone. The first message was from Jake. "You okay? Call me if you need anything." The second was from my boss, reminding me about a meeting I was supposed to attend the next morning. And the third was from Emily. "Where are you? I'm worried about you. Please come home so we can talk." I stared at her message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. What could I even say to her? That I was sitting in a greasy diner, questioning everything I thought I knew about us? That I didn't know if I could look at her without hearing those awful words she'd said? In the end, I put my phone down without responding. I wasn't ready to talk to her, not yet. By the time I left the diner, it was close to midnight. I found a cheap motel on the outskirts of town and checked in, paying in cash so there'd be no paper trail. The room was exactly what you'd expect. A bed with a lumpy mattress, a TV that only got 3 channels, and a lamp that flickered whenever I turned it on. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For now. The first night was the hardest. Lying there in that unfamiliar room, everything hit me at once. The weight of what I'd lost, the uncertainty of what came next. It was suffocating. I wanted to call Emily to tell her I was sorry for whatever I'd done to make her feel this way, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. She needed space, and I needed to respect that. Over the next few days, I fell into a strange routine. I went to work during the day, doing my best to keep up appearances, and returned to the motel at night. I avoided calls from friends and family, not ready to explain why I wasn't at home. Jake checked in on me regularly, and while I appreciated it, I couldn't bring myself to lean on him too much. This was my mess, and I needed to deal with it. One night, about a week after I'd left, I finally broke. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, flipping aimlessly through TV channels, when I came across an old movie Emily and I had watched on one of our first dates. It was a cheesy rom-com, the kind she loved and I pretended to tolerate. Seeing it again brought back a flood of memories. Her laugh, the way she'd nudge me when I made a sarcastic comment about the plot, the way she looked at me like I was the only person in the world who mattered. I couldn't hold it in anymore. The tears came fast and hard, and I didn't try to stop them. For the first time since I walked out of that house, I let myself feel everything, the grief, the anger, the confusion. It was like a dam had broken inside me, and all the emotions I'd been bottling up came rushing out at once. By the time I was done, I felt raw, like I'd been stripped down to nothing. That moment of vulnerability scared me, but it also brought clarity. I couldn't keep running from my pain, hiding in a motel room and hoping it would all magically get better. If I wanted to move forward, I needed to face the reality of what had happened. The next morning I made a decision. I called my boss and took a week off work. Then I packed my things and checked out of the motel. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I knew I needed to get out of town, away from all the reminders of what I'd lost. I needed time to clear my head and figure out what came next. Before I left, I sent Emily a text. It was short and to the point. "I'm taking some time away to think. I hope you're doing the same." She didn't respond right away, and I didn't expect her to. I wasn't even sure if I wanted her to. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about me, about figuring out who I was without her and what I wanted from my life. I hit the road with no destination in mind, just a vague sense of needing to get as far away as possible. I drove for hours, the miles rolling by like a blur. Eventually, I found myself in a small coastal town I'd never been to before. It was quiet, the kind of place where you could hear the waves crashing from just about anywhere. I found a little bed and breakfast near the beach and checked in, determined to make the most of my time there. Over the next few days, I started to feel a little more like myself. I spent my mornings walking along the shore, letting the salt air clear my head. I picked up a journal at a local bookstore and started writing down my thoughts, something I hadn't done in years. At first it felt awkward, but soon the words started to flow. Writing became my way of processing everything, of making sense of the chaos in my mind. I also forced myself to reflect on my relationship with Emily, not just the good parts, but the cracks that had been there all along. I thought about the times I'd ignored her concerns, brushing them off as unimportant. I thought about the way I'd focused so much on building a future for us that I'd stopped paying attention to the present. And I thought about the ways she'd hurt me too. Her secrecy, her emotional distance, the way she'd confided in someone else instead of talking to me. It wasn't easy to face those truths, but it was necessary. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was starting to see the situation clearly. And while I didn't have all the answers yet, one thing was becoming certain. I couldn't go back to the way things were. Whether or not Emily and I had a future together, I needed to find myself again first. By the time I left the coastal town, something inside me had shifted. I wasn't fixed or completely healed, not by a long shot, but I felt more grounded, like I'd finally managed to claw my way out of the hole I'd been stuck in. The quiet mornings, the sound of waves crashing on the shore, and the simple act of writing my thoughts down in a journal had given me clarity. I still didn't have all the answers, but I no longer felt like I was drowning. For the first time in weeks, I could see a way forward. Returning to the city wasn't easy. Every corner of it held a memory of Emily, our favorite restaurant, the park where we'd spent lazy Sundays, even the grocery store where we'd argued over which brand of pasta sauce to buy. But I knew I couldn't let those memories hold me back. I had to keep moving. The first thing I did was move out of the house. Living there wasn't an option anymore. Every room was a reminder of the life we'd tried to build together, a life that was now just a collection of broken promises. I found a small studio apartment closer to work. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. The act of packing up my things and stepping into a new space felt like closing a chapter and opening a new one. Jake, ever the loyal friend, helped me with the move. He showed up with his truck and a stack of empty boxes, cracking jokes to keep the mood light as we loaded up my stuff. "Man, you've got way too many books," he said, struggling to carry a box marked living room. "Ever heard of a Kindle?" "Books have character," I shot back, smirking. "You wouldn't understand." "Yeah, well, your character is giving me back pain," he grumbled, dropping the box onto the truck bed. Despite his complaints, Jake stuck it out, hauling box after box up to my third-floor walk-up without a single word of protest. By the time we were done, both of us were drenched in sweat, but the apartment was starting to feel like home. "Thanks, man," I said, handing him a cold beer once we'd finished. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Jake waved me off, taking a long sip. "What are friends for? Besides, I needed the workout." As we sat there, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, Jake turned to me with a serious expression. "So," he said, "how are you holding up, really?" I hesitated, not sure how to put it into words. "Honestly, it's been hard," I admitted, "but I think I'm getting there. This, moving out, starting over, it feels good, like I can finally breathe again." Jake nodded, his face softening. "Good, you deserve that, man." His support meant the world to me. For weeks he'd been my rock, the one person who never hesitated to pick up the phone when I called or show up when I needed him. I didn't know how I'd repay him, but I silently vowed to try. The days that followed were a mix of highs and lows. Some mornings I woke up feeling like I could conquer the world. Other times the weight of everything hit me all over again, and I found myself staring at the ceiling, unable to move. But little by little I started to rebuild. I threw myself into work, taking on new projects and challenges to keep my mind occupied. I hit the gym for the first time in months, rediscovering how good it felt to push my body to its limits. I even reconnected with a few old friends, people I hadn't seen in years because I'd been so wrapped up in my relationship with Emily. Through it all, I kept journaling. It had started as a way to process my emotions, but it quickly became something more. Writing gave me a sense of control, a way to organize the chaos in my mind. I wrote about everything: my fears, my regrets, the things I wanted to do differently moving forward. The more I wrote, the more I began to understand myself. I realized how much of my identity I'd tied to my relationship with Emily, how I'd lost sight of who I was outside of us. A month after I moved into the apartment, Emily reached out again. Her text was simple: "Can we meet? I think we need to talk." For a long time, I stared at the message, debating whether to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to keep moving forward without looking back. But another part of me, the part that still cared about her despite everything, knew we couldn't leave things unresolved. I needed closure, even if it hurt. We agreed to meet at a small cafe near her work, one of those cozy places with mismatched furniture and too many potted plants. When I walked in, Emily was already there, sitting at a corner table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She looked up as I approached, and for a moment, I saw the Emily I'd fallen in love with. The one who laughed at my dumb jokes and made me feel like the luckiest guy in the world. "Hey," she said softly, offering me a small smile. "Hey," I replied, sliding into the seat across from her. For a moment, neither of us said anything, the silence stretching between us like a canyon. Then, finally, she broke it. "Thanks for meeting me." "Yeah," I said, my voice steady. "I think we both needed this." We spent the next hour laying everything out on the table. She apologized for the way she'd hurt me, for not being honest about her feelings sooner. I told her about the pain I'd been carrying, the doubts and fears that had consumed me since that night. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was honest, and in the end, that's what we both needed. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "but I hope we can find peace no matter what happens." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Me too." When we parted ways, there were no promises of getting back together, no grand declarations of love. Just two people trying to find their way forward, separately but with mutual respect. It wasn't the ending I'd imagined for us, but it felt right. Or at least, as right as it could feel under the circumstances. After that conversation with Emily, something inside me shifted. It wasn't like a magic switch flipped, erasing all the pain and confusion I'd been carrying, but it felt like a door had closed, a necessary one. For the first time in months, I felt like I could focus on moving forward, unburdened by the weight of unfinished business. The days turned into weeks, and I threw myself into rebuilding my life. The small studio apartment I'd moved into, which had initially felt like little more than a crash pad, slowly became a home. I bought a second-hand bookshelf and filled it with my favorite novels. I hung some art on the walls, mostly landscapes that reminded me of the coastal town where I'd started to heal. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and I took pride in making it feel like my space. Work became another anchor for me. I started volunteering for extra projects, throwing myself into tasks that challenged me in new ways. For the first time in years, I felt excited about my career, like I was finally working toward something meaningful. My boss even took notice, pulling me aside after a big presentation to tell me how impressed he was with my dedication. "You've really stepped up lately," he said, clapping me on the back. "Keep this up, and I can see a promotion in your future." Hearing that was a boost I didn't realize I needed. For so long, I'd been measuring my worth in terms of my relationship with Emily, what I could provide, how I could make her happy. But now I was learning to value myself on my own terms. Outside of work, I started exploring hobbies I'd neglected during my relationship. I dusted off my guitar, which had been sitting in the corner of my closet for years, and started playing again. At first, my fingers stumbled over the strings, but it didn't take long for the muscle memory to kick in. Playing music became a form of therapy for me, a way to express emotions I couldn't put into words. One day, while browsing a local community board, I saw a flyer for an open mic night at a nearby cafe. On a whim, I decided to sign up. The thought of performing in front of an audience was nerve-wracking, but it also felt exhilarating. When the night came, I stood on that small stage, my heart pounding in my chest, and played a cover of a song that had always meant something to me. The applause that followed wasn't overwhelming, but it was enough to remind me that I still had something to offer. I also started reconnecting with old friends, people I hadn't seen in years because I'd been so focused on building a future with Emily. One of those friends was Sarah, a former co-worker who'd moved to a neighboring city a while back. We'd always gotten along well, and when she reached out to grab lunch one day, I figured why not? Sitting across from her at a little Italian place downtown, I realized how much I'd missed having easy, natural conversations. We talked about everything: work, mutual friends, even the embarrassing moments from our old office days that still made us laugh. "You seem lighter," Sarah said at one point, giving me a curious look, "like you're finally coming up for air." I smiled, though it felt bittersweet. "That's one way to put it. It's been a rough few months, but I think I'm starting to figure things out." "Well, whatever you're doing, keep it up," she said with a grin. "It looks good on you." That conversation stuck with me long after the lunch ended. It was a reminder that healing wasn't just about leaving the past behind. It was about rediscovering the parts of myself that I'd lost along the way. As I continued to rebuild, I found myself thinking less and less about Emily. It wasn't that I didn't care about her anymore. I did. But the sharp edges of our breakup had softened, replaced by a quiet acceptance that we were on different paths now. I hoped she was finding her own way just as I was finding mine. One evening, while journaling, I came across a quote I'd scribbled down during my time at the coast: "The only way out is through." At the time, it had felt like little more than a cliché, something I wrote down because it sounded profound. But now, sitting in my cozy little apartment, with music playing softly in the background and the scent of dinner wafting from the kitchen, it hit me differently. I'd been through the fire, and while I wasn't completely unscathed, I'd come out stronger on the other side. Months passed, and life slowly found a new rhythm. The pain of losing Emily no longer felt like a raw wound, more like a faded scar. It was still there, a reminder of what I'd been through, but it no longer defined me. I had grown in ways I never imagined, and for the first time in a long time I felt hopeful about the future. Work was thriving. True to my boss's word, I was promoted to a team lead position, a step that came with more responsibilities but also more opportunities to prove myself. I poured my energy into the role, balancing leadership with creativity in ways that felt fulfilling. The sense of accomplishment I got from my work wasn't something I'd experienced in a long time, and it reminded me of the person I used to be before everything fell apart. My personal life also began to bloom in unexpected ways. I joined a local hiking group, partly as a way to stay active and partly because I missed the connection to nature that I'd rediscovered during my time on the coast. The group was a mix of people from all walks of life: college students, retirees, families, but there was one person who stood out, a woman named Rachel. Rachel had this infectious energy, the kind of enthusiasm that made everyone around her feel more alive. She was quick with a joke and even quicker to lend a hand when someone stumbled on the trail. Over time, we started talking more during our hikes, and I found myself drawn to her positivity and warmth. One evening, after a particularly challenging trek, we all gathered around a campfire to share stories and snacks. Rachel sat next to me, her cheeks flushed from the cool night air, and we ended up talking long after the others had gone to bed. She told me about her love for photography and how she dreamed of traveling the world to capture its beauty. I shared my own dreams, ones I hadn't spoken out loud in years, and for the first time I felt truly seen. It wasn't long before we started seeing each other outside of the hiking group. At first it was casual, grabbing coffee, exploring local trails, but as the weeks went on, our connection deepened. Rachel wasn't just someone I enjoyed spending time with. She was someone who made me believe in the possibility of love again. It scared me at first, the idea of opening myself up to someone new, but Rachel had a way of making me feel safe, like it was okay to take the risk. One night, as we walked along the waterfront, she turned to me and asked, Do you ever think about the past? Like, does it ever hold you back? Her question caught me off guard, but I answered honestly. I used to, I admitted. For a long time I let it weigh me down, but I think I've learned to let it go, or at least to not let it define me anymore. Rachel smiled, slipping her hand into mine. That's brave, she said. I think a lot of people get stuck in the past. It's hard to move forward when you're carrying all that weight. Her words stayed with me as we continued walking, the sound of the waves lapping against the shore providing a soothing backdrop. I realized then how far I'd come, not just in terms of healing, but in my ability to embrace the unknown. Rachel wasn't Emily, and this relationship wasn't some attempt to replace what I'd lost. It was something new, something that felt like it could be the start of a beautiful chapter. A few weeks later, I received a message from Emily. It was unexpected, her name popping up on my screen like a ghost from the past. She kept it brief, saying she'd heard about my promotion and wanted to congratulate me. She also mentioned that she'd started seeing someone new and hoped I was doing well. Reading her message stirred something inside me, not pain or anger, but a bittersweet kind of relief. I was happy for her, genuinely. We'd both found our own paths, and while those paths had diverged, I no longer felt the need to look back. I sent her a polite reply, wishing her all the best, and then deleted the conversation. It felt like closing the final door on that chapter of my life. As the seasons changed, so did I. The man who had walked out of that house months ago, broken, confused, and unsure of his place in the world, was gone. In his place was someone stronger, someone who had learned to stand on his own 2 feet and embrace the unpredictability of life. I wasn't the same person I'd been with Emily, and I was okay with that. In fact, I was grateful for it. Rachel and I continued to grow closer, and while I didn't know what the future held for us, I was excited to find out. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be, moving forward, one step at a time, with hope in my heart and a clear view of the road ahead. Story 2. I rescued my dad's failing company, built a $150 million empire, and faced my brother's betrayal. Hi, Reddit. Have you ever faced one of those moments where your entire life feels like it's hanging by a thread? That was me about 10 years ago. I was staring at a massive mess, not one I had created, mind you, but one I couldn't just walk away from either. Let me rewind and give you some context. My dad, Robert, was the kind of man you'd admire for his grit and determination. He built a company from nothing, a testament to years of sweat, hustle, and sacrifice. But while he was great at building things, managing finances wasn't exactly his strong suit. By the time I was 26, fresh out of business school, the company was teetering on the brink of collapse. And my dad? He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, visibly aged beyond his years. And then there was Ryan, my older brother. At 31, he was the textbook definition of the golden child. Ryan had charm in spades, the kind that could win people over effortlessly. But while I was buried in spreadsheets and trying to understand the intricacies of supply chains, Ryan was busy living his best life. Exotic vacations, high-end parties, expensive hobbies. You name it, Ryan was doing it. Somehow, despite all this, he remained Dad's favorite. Always had been, always would be. It wasn't a new revelation. Ryan had always been the one who could do no wrong, but knowing it didn't make it sting any less. I had grown used to being overlooked, but the weight of that dynamic seemed heavier now, especially as I watched Dad struggle. One night I walked into Dad's office. It was late, and the place looked like a disaster zone. Stacks of unpaid invoices towered precariously on his desk, and contracts were scattered everywhere. It was as if someone had turned the office into a war zone of paperwork. Dad didn't even notice me walk in at first. He was hunched over, staring blankly at the chaos around him. Finally, he looked up, and I could see the exhaustion etched into his face. "I think it's over, Josh," he said, his voice heavy. "I don't know how to fix this." Hearing those words was like getting punched in the gut. This was the man who had taught me everything about perseverance and hard work, the man I had always seen as unshakable. And now, he was telling me he had reached his breaking point. Something inside me snapped. "I'll take care of it," I told him, my voice steadier than I felt. I'm not sure if he believed me. I wasn't even sure if I believed myself. But he didn't argue. If anything, he looked relieved, as though a part of him had been waiting for someone to step in. From that moment, I threw myself into the company. I practically lived at the office, diving headfirst into every single aspect of the business. I analyzed every process, pored over every financial record, and spoke to every client. Most of them weren't interested in hearing from me. To them, I was just some kid, inexperienced and desperate. Doors were slammed in my face, both literally and figuratively, more times than I can count. But I didn't give up. I couldn't. Slowly but surely, people began to notice. Even those who had dismissed me at first started to take me seriously. The first year was nothing short of grueling. I was working 16-hour days, 7 days a week, and it felt like the company's survival depended entirely on me. Dad officially stayed at the helm, but he handed over almost all decision-making to me. One of my first moves was cutting unnecessary expenses, and yes, that included Ryan's habit of charging personal luxuries to the company's account. Unsurprisingly, he didn't take that well. One day, Ryan strolled into the office, his trademark smirk plastered across his face. "Look at you, playing CEO," he sneered. "Don't get too comfortable. Dad won't let you keep it." I didn't bother responding. I'd grown used to his digs. Ryan had a way of taking credit for things he didn't do while dodging blame for his mistakes, but this wasn't about him. It wasn't even about earning Dad's approval. I was doing this because I couldn't stand the thought of letting everything my father had built go to waste. By the end of that first year, there were glimmers of hope. The company wasn't thriving yet, but we weren't drowning either. We had managed to stabilize. Clients who had once written us off were beginning to return. Employees who had feared for their jobs started to feel secure again. And for the first time in years, the company turned a modest profit. But of course, success didn't fix everything. Dad was proud of what I'd accomplished, but in his eyes, Ryan was still untouchable. At family dinners, while I was busy thinking about ways to expand the business, Dad would go on and on about Ryan's supposed business acumen. It stung to hear, but I learned to tune it out. I wasn't doing this for applause or recognition. My goals were bigger than that. I wanted to build something sustainable, something we could all be proud of. The decision to step in and take over the company was one thing. Actually doing it was a whole other beast. My initial optimism was quickly met with the brutal reality of how much work there was to do. This wasn't some small corner store operation. It was a mid-sized corporation with tangled financials, outdated systems, and dwindling morale. The deeper I dug, the more it felt like I was trying to bail water out of a sinking ship with a teaspoon. The first order of business was understanding where the money was going, and let me tell you, it wasn't a pretty picture. There were bloated contracts, inefficient processes, and an absolute lack of accountability. The cherry on top? Ryan's lavish spending. Every time I looked at the company's expense records, I found another one of his indulgences. A new golf club membership here. A vacation charged as a business retreat there. It was infuriating, but not surprising. Cutting those expenses was the easy part. The hard part was rebuilding trust with clients, employees, and even myself. Many of our clients had been burned by missed deadlines and broken promises. They weren't interested in hearing from me, the inexperienced kid who, in their eyes, was probably just as unreliable as the company I represented. But I refused to give up. I called. I emailed. I visited offices in person. I heard more no's than I ever thought possible, but every once in a while I'd get a yes. Those small victories kept me going. Then there were the employees. They were understandably skeptical of me. Most of them had been around long enough to see the company's decline firsthand, and I think they saw me as just another temporary patch in a sinking boat. I needed to show them that I was serious. I started by meeting with everyone, from department heads to interns. I asked questions. I listened. And I made it clear that I wasn't just there to keep the lights on. I was there to turn things around. One of the most difficult but necessary changes was downsizing. It was heartbreaking to let people go, especially those who had been loyal to the company through thick and thin. But the reality was that we couldn't afford to keep everyone. I hated being the one to deliver the news, but I made sure to do it personally. I owed them that much. Each conversation ended with an apology and a promise to provide a glowing reference for their next role. At the same time, I worked to incentivize the remaining employees. Bonuses were out of the question. We didn't have the money, but I found other ways to boost morale. I started hosting regular town hall meetings where I updated everyone on the company's progress, no matter how small. I created an open-door policy so anyone could bring me their ideas or concerns. Slowly, I noticed a shift. People started believing in me, or at least in the possibility of change. Meanwhile, Ryan continued to make my life as difficult as possible. Every step forward felt like 2 steps back with him around. He'd show up at the office unannounced, cracking jokes about my late nights and early mornings. "You know, Josh," he said once, leaning against my office door, "you should really get a life outside of this place. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy." I ignored him as I usually did, but it was hard not to feel the sting. Ryan had never worked a day in his life, not really, and yet he carried himself like he owned the place, and in Dad's eyes he practically did. But I wasn't doing this for Ryan or even for Dad. I was doing it because the company meant something to me. It was a symbol of my father's hard work, his legacy, and I couldn't let it crumble. Not on my watch. About 6 months into my efforts, I started seeing real progress. We renegotiated several contracts, cutting costs significantly. I implemented new systems to streamline operations and brought in a consultant to train our sales team on best practices. The company wasn't just surviving anymore, it was starting to turn a corner. But with progress came new challenges. Ryan, sensing the company's revival, began showing up more frequently. He'd sit in meetings, nodding along as if he had been part of the turnaround all along. It was infuriating, but I held my tongue. Dad's blind spot for Ryan was something I couldn't change, no matter how much I wanted to. At home, things weren't much better. My friends stopped inviting me to hang out because I was always at the office. My social life was non-existent, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd done something just for myself. But every time I felt like giving up, I'd think back to that night in Dad's office, the look of relief on his face when I said I'd handle it. That kept me going. By the end of the year, the company had stabilized. It wasn't thriving yet, but we were in the black for the first time in years. Clients who had abandoned us were starting to return, and employees who had been on edge were beginning to relax. It felt like we were finally turning a corner. And yet, in the midst of all this progress, one thing remained constant. Ryan was still the favorite. No matter how hard I worked or how much I achieved, Dad always found a way to credit Ryan for our success. Over dinner, he'd talk about Ryan's natural leadership skills or his keen business sense, completely ignoring the fact that Ryan hadn't lifted a finger to help. It stung, but I kept my focus on the bigger picture. I wasn't doing this for recognition. I was doing it to prove, to myself, if no one else, that I could take something broken and make it whole again. The start of the second year felt like climbing out of a trench. We weren't at the top yet, but we weren't buried anymore either. The company's reputation, once in tatters, was starting to recover. Clients who had once slammed the door in my face were now giving me a chance, not because they suddenly believed in me, but because they saw the results. Numbers don't lie, and ours were finally starting to look promising. With that momentum, I knew it was time to tackle bigger challenges. The company needed a complete overhaul, not just cosmetic changes. I started pushing for modernization, which wasn't easy. Dad was resistant to the idea of replacing older systems. He saw them as a part of the company's history, a relic of the hard work he'd put in over the years. But history doesn't pay the bills, and if we wanted to stay competitive, we had to adapt. "Dad, the market's evolving," I explained during one of our late-night conversations. "If we don't evolve with it, we're going to fall behind. Again." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I built this place with these systems, Josh. They've gotten us this far." "And they almost drove us into the ground," I said more bluntly than I intended. "It's not about disrespecting the past, it's about securing the future." Eventually, he relented. We started implementing new technologies, from updated software to streamlined communication tools. It was an expensive and time-consuming process, but I knew it was worth it. Slowly, our efficiency improved, and so did our profit margins. On the employee front, morale continued to climb. I introduced new policies aimed at making people feel valued, things like flexible work hours, recognition programs, and team-building events. They weren't grand gestures, but they made a difference. For the first time in years, people seemed genuinely excited to come to work. Of course, not everyone was on board. Ryan, for one, had no interest in anything remotely productive. His visits to the office became more frequent, and with each one, it felt like he was trying to assert his presence. He'd walk around like he owned the place, throwing out half-baked ideas and demanding updates on projects he had no involvement in. "Why are we spending so much on this tech upgrade?" he asked during one meeting, leaning back in his chair like he was the boss. "Seems like a waste of money to me." I took a deep breath, resisting the urge to snap. "It's an investment, Ryan. If we don't modernize, we're going to lose clients. The numbers are clear." He shrugged. "If you say so, just don't screw it up." It wasn't just Ryan's attitude that grated on me. It was the way Dad let him get away with it. No matter what Ryan did or didn't do, he was always the golden boy. And as much as I tried to ignore it, there were moments when the favoritism felt like a slap in the face. One evening, after a particularly frustrating day, I was having dinner at Dad's house. The conversation turned, as it often did, to Ryan. "Ryan's got a good head for business," Dad said between bites of his steak. "I think he could really bring something to the company." I stared at him, dumbfounded. "Dad, Ryan hasn't contributed anything. He doesn't even understand how the company works." "That's not fair," Dad replied. "He has ideas. He just needs the right guidance." I bit my tongue, knowing it was pointless to argue. If Dad wanted to see Ryan as a business genius, nothing I said was going to change his mind. Despite the challenges, I stayed focused on my goals. My vision for the company was bigger than any one person's opinion, even Dad's. I wanted to build something that could stand the test of time, something that could weather storms and still come out stronger on the other side. And for a while it felt like we were getting there. Revenue continued to climb, and we started expanding into new markets. I negotiated partnerships that opened doors we'd never even considered before. The company was no longer just surviving, it was thriving. But with success came new complications. As the business grew, so did Ryan's interest in it. He started attending more meetings, making more appearances, and acting like he was an integral part of the operation. Everyone knew better, of course, but no one dared to call him out, not even me. I couldn't risk creating tension that might derail everything we'd worked so hard to achieve. Looking back, I realized that was the first sign of trouble. Ryan didn't like being overshadowed, and as the company's success became more visible, so did my role in it. He'd make little digs during meetings, jokes disguised as criticism. "Don't work too hard, Josh," he'd say with a smirk. "You might burn yourself out." I tried to brush it off, telling myself that his insecurities weren't my problem. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just harmless teasing. Ryan was angling for something, though I didn't know what. For the time being, I pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the work. There was still so much to do, and I wasn't going to let Ryan's antics distract me. By the end of the second year, the company was a completely different entity. We had gone from the brink of collapse to being a leader in our industry. Clients who had once written us off were now singing our praises, and employees who had feared for their jobs were thriving in their roles. It should have felt like a victory, and in some ways, it did. But in the back of my mind, there was always this nagging sense of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that Ryan wasn't done causing problems, and that when he made his move, it wouldn't be subtle. By the third year, the company had transformed into something I could genuinely be proud of. We weren't just surviving, we were thriving. Revenue was climbing steadily, and we'd broken into several new markets, securing contracts I wouldn't have even dreamed of when I first stepped in. Our name, once associated with broken promises and inefficiency, now carried weight again. It felt like the years of sacrifice were finally paying off, but with success came new pressures. The company's growth had put us on the radar of competitors, and I found myself navigating challenges on multiple fronts. New deals required intricate negotiations, and every decision seemed to carry greater weight. I threw myself into the work, determined to maintain our upward trajectory. And then there was Ryan. If he'd been a thorn in my side before, now he was a full-blown obstacle. As the company grew, so did his involvement, or at least the appearance of it. He started showing up to every major meeting, inserting himself into conversations he clearly didn't understand. He'd interrupt with half-baked suggestions, or try to take credit for ideas he hadn't even heard of until moments before. It was exhausting. What made it worse was how Dad encouraged him. No matter how much I accomplished, Ryan was always positioned as the prodigal son, the future leader of the company. "He's got great instincts," Dad would say, as if that somehow made up for the fact that Ryan barely lifted a finger. I'd smile and nod, knowing there was no point arguing. Dad's blind spot for Ryan wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't just annoying, it was dangerous. Ryan's need to be in the spotlight meant he started making promises to clients without consulting anyone. I'd walk into meetings only to discover that Ryan had agreed to terms we couldn't possibly meet, or timelines that were completely unrealistic. Cleaning up his messes became a full-time job on top of my actual responsibilities. One particular incident stands out. We were in the middle of negotiating a lucrative deal with a major client. It had taken months to get them on board, and the final contract was nearly ready. Then Ryan, in his infinite wisdom, decided to call the client directly. He promised them additional services, ones we hadn't even discussed internally, at no extra cost. By the time I found out the client was already celebrating their great deal, I confronted Ryan immediately. "What the hell were you thinking?" I demanded. He shrugged, leaning back in his chair like he didn't have a care in the world. "I was just trying to seal the deal. You're welcome, by the way." "Welcome," I repeated, incredulous. "Do you have any idea how much this is going to cost us?" "It's an investment," he said dismissively. "You're always talking about the big picture, right?" I wanted to scream. Instead, I took a deep breath and walked out. Fixing Ryan's mistakes had become part of the job, and no amount of yelling was going to change that. As frustrating as it was, I still believed in what I was doing. The company's success wasn't just about numbers. It was about proving that I could build something lasting, something that mattered. Every new milestone felt like a small victory, even if Ryan and Dad refused to acknowledge it. But beneath the surface, tensions were boiling over. Ryan's resentment toward me was growing more obvious by the day. He hated that I was the one driving the company's success, even if he wouldn't admit it outright. And I couldn't shake the feeling that he was planning something. That feeling turned out to be more than just paranoia. One day, out of the blue, Dad called an emergency shareholders meeting. He wouldn't tell me what it was about, but his tone was serious. I spent the night before going over every possible scenario trying to figure out what was going on. I thought maybe it was a big acquisition or a major policy change, something important but manageable. I couldn't have been more wrong. When I walked into the boardroom the next morning, the tension in the air was palpable. Ryan was already there, looking far too smug for my liking. Dad sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. The meeting started like any other. Dad gave a brief overview of the company's progress, praising our recent successes. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he was finally going to acknowledge my contributions. And then he dropped the bombshell. "Effective immediately," Dad announced, "Ryan will be stepping into the role of CEO." It felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. I stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. Ryan? CEO? The same Ryan who had done nothing but ride on the company's coattails for years? It didn't make any sense. "Dad," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "what are you talking about?" He looked at me with something almost like pity. "You've done an incredible job, Josh, truly. But Ryan has the leadership qualities we need to take this company to the next level." Leadership qualities? I wanted to laugh. Ryan didn't know the first thing about running a company. He could barely manage his own life, let alone an entire organization. Ryan, for his part, looked like the cat that got the cream. He leaned back in his chair, a smug grin spreading across his face. "Don't take it personally, little brother," he said. "It's just business. Just business." The phrase echoed in my head as I sat there, stunned. Everything I had worked for, every late night, every sacrifice, it all felt like it had been for nothing. I didn't argue, I didn't yell, I didn't even cry. I just stood up, nodded, and walked out. There was nothing left to say. Walking out of that shareholders' meeting felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart from the outside. My hands were shaking, but I kept my head high. I wasn't about to give Ryan or Dad the satisfaction of seeing me break. But inside, I was a storm of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. I went straight to my office, closed the door, and just sat there, staring at the walls, at the files on my desk, at the notes about ongoing projects. I realized all of it would soon belong to Ryan. The thought was like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a job to me. It was my life, my purpose, and now it was being handed over to someone who hadn't earned it, someone who didn't care about it the way I did. I spent the rest of the day tying up loose ends. I knew I couldn't stay. There was no way I could work under Ryan, watching him dismantle everything I'd built piece by piece. So I started drafting my resignation letter. It was short, and to the point. Effective immediately, I was stepping down from my role. No explanations, no dramatics. Just the facts. When I handed the letter to Dad later that evening, he looked genuinely surprised. "You don't have to do this, Josh," he said, his voice almost pleading. "There's still a place for you here." "A place for me? Under Ryan's thumb? No thanks." "I appreciate everything you've done for me, Dad," I said, keeping my tone steady. "But I can't be here anymore. Not like this." He sighed heavily, but he didn't try to argue. I think on some level he knew this was inevitable. As I packed up my things, a few of my colleagues stopped by to say goodbye. Some of them were shocked, others just sad. "You're the reason we're still here, Josh," one of them said. "It's not going to be the same without you." I didn't have the heart to tell them that it wouldn't be the same without me. It would be worse. I knew Ryan well enough to know that he wasn't equipped to handle the pressures of leadership. He'd coast along on my successes for a while, but when the cracks started to show, he wouldn't know how to fix them. And Dad? He'd probably sweep in to clean up the mess, just like he always did. The next few weeks were a blur. I spent most of my time trying to figure out what came next. Starting over wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. No more 16-hour days. No more cleaning up after Ryan. No more fighting for recognition I was never going to get. I thought leaving the company would be the hardest part, but what hurt the most was the silence. Dad barely called, and when he did, the conversations were short and awkward. Ryan didn't bother reaching out at all, not that I expected him to. I felt like I'd been erased from their lives, like all the sacrifices I'd made didn't matter anymore. One night I was sitting on my couch, scrolling through job postings, when my phone buzzed. It was a message from one of my former colleagues. "Thought you should know. Ryan's already undoing half of what you put in place. Morale's down, and a few of the clients you brought back are jumping ship." I stared at the screen, a mix of anger and vindication washing over me. Part of me wanted to storm back into that office and fix everything. But the larger part of me knew it wasn't my problem anymore. They had made their choice. Now they had to live with it. Over the next few months, I focused on rebuilding my life. I took some consulting gigs, using the skills I'd honed to help other struggling businesses. It wasn't the same as running my dad's company, but it was fulfilling in its own way. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my own destiny. But the past has a way of catching up with you. About 6 months after I left, I got a call from Dad. It was late, and his voice sounded tired, defeated even. "Josh," he said, "I think I made a mistake." I didn't say anything, waiting for him to continue. "The company's not doing well," he admitted. "He's not handling things the way I thought he would. I need your help." There it was, the moment I'd dreamed of and dreaded all at once. Part of me wanted to say no, to remind him that he'd chosen Ryan over me. But another part of me, the part that still cared about the company and the people who worked there, couldn't just turn my back. "I'll think about it," I said, my voice calm but firm. "But if I come back, things have to be different." Dad hesitated, and I could tell he didn't like the idea of giving up control. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I mean no more playing favorites," I said. "If I'm going to fix this, I need to be the one in charge. No interference, no second-guessing." There was a long pause. Finally he sighed. I'll talk to Ryan." That was the last thing I wanted to hear. "You do that," I said, and then I hung up. I wasn't going to hold my breath. I didn't hear back from Dad for weeks after that phone call. I assumed he'd talked to Ryan and, as expected, nothing had changed. If anything, I figured Ryan had probably doubled down, convinced he could handle everything on his own. Part of me felt a strange sense of closure. I had given them a chance, and if they didn't want to take it, that was their choice. I was finally free to move forward without looking back. In the meantime, I kept busy with my consulting work. Helping other companies felt like a way to channel everything I'd learned over the years, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Each project was a reminder that I was capable, that my hard work hadn't been in vain. I wasn't just the guy who saved a sinking ship. I was someone who could build something meaningful from the ground up, no matter the odds. But then, out of nowhere, Dad called again. This time, his voice sounded even more strained than before. "Josh," he said without preamble, "I need you to come to the office." "What's going on?" I asked, already bracing myself for the answer. "It's Ryan," he said with a heavy sigh. "He's made some questionable decisions. We've lost a couple of key clients, and morale is at an all-time low. The board is starting to get restless." I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. "Dad, I told you what my conditions were. Has anything changed?" There was a pause, and then, quietly, he said, "Yes, Ryan's agreed to step down." That caught me off guard. Ryan stepping down? It didn't seem possible. "And you're okay with this?" I asked. "I don't have a choice," Dad admitted. "We're running out of options." I told him I'd think about it and hung up. The truth was, I didn't need time to decide. I knew I was going back. As much as I wanted to stay angry, as much as I wanted to hold on to my pride, I couldn't. This company wasn't just a business to me. It was a legacy. It was my father's life's work, and whether I liked it or not, it was part of mine too. When I walked back into the office a few days later, it felt like stepping into a time machine. Not much had changed on the surface, but the atmosphere was completely different. The energy I'd worked so hard to build was gone, replaced by a sense of unease. People greeted me with a mix of relief and trepidation, as if they weren't sure whether to celebrate my return or brace for another upheaval. My first meeting with the board was tense. They wanted answers. How had things gone so wrong so quickly? I didn't waste time pointing fingers. Instead, I laid out a plan to stabilize the company and rebuild trust with our clients. It wasn't going to be easy, but I knew it was possible. I'd done it before, and I could do it again. As for Ryan, our interactions were brief and professional. He avoided eye contact during the handover process, and I didn't push him. There was no point in rehashing old wounds. I was there to fix the company, not to relive the drama. Over the next several months, I threw myself back into the work. It was exhausting, but also invigorating. I renegotiated contracts, brought back clients who had left, and implemented new policies to rebuild employee morale. Slowly but surely, the company began to recover. One of the most surprising moments came during a conversation with Dad. We were sitting in his office late one evening, going over the latest financial reports. For the first time in a long time, the numbers were trending in the right direction. "You've done good work, Josh," he said, breaking the silence. I looked up, startled. Compliments from Dad were rare, to say the least. "Thanks," I said cautiously, waiting for the inevitable but. "I mean it," he continued. "I should have seen it sooner. You're the one who kept this company alive, not Ryan. I don't know why it took me so long to admit it, but I'm proud of you." Those words hit me harder than I expected. For years, I'd been chasing Dad's approval, telling myself I didn't need it while secretly craving it. Hearing him say he was proud of me felt like a weight I didn't even realize I was carrying had been lifted. "Thanks, Dad," I said quietly, not trusting myself to say more. As the company continued to grow, I started thinking about the future, not just for the business but for myself. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life cleaning up other people's messes. I wanted to create something that was entirely mine, something I could look back on with pride. So, I made a decision. Once the company was stable enough to run without me, I would step away for good. It wasn't an easy choice, but it felt like the right one. I'd given everything I had to this business, and now it was time to see what else I could do. When I finally shared my plans with Dad, he didn't argue. "You've earned it," he said simply. "Just don't forget where you came from." "I won't," I promised, and I meant it. Looking back on everything, I realized that saving the company wasn't just about keeping my dad's dream alive. It was about proving something to myself, that I was capable, that I could take on the impossible and come out stronger on the other side. And as I prepared to take the next step in my journey, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: hope. Walking away from the company for the second time was different. This time, it wasn't about anger or betrayal. It was about peace. I knew I'd done everything I could to stabilize and grow the business, and I was finally leaving on my own terms. Before I stepped away, Dad and I had one last meaningful conversation. It was late one evening, and we were sitting in his office, much like that night years ago when I promised to save the company. "You're really going to leave this time?" Dad asked, his voice heavy with emotion. "Yeah," I said. "It's time for me to build something of my own." He nodded slowly, staring out the window. "I always thought I'd pass this company down to Ryan," he admitted. "I guess I was wrong about a lot of things." I stayed quiet, letting him work through his thoughts. "I'm glad it was you," he continued. "You didn't just save the company, you made it better. You built something I never could have imagined. I'm proud of you, son." Those words hit me harder than I expected. For years, I had quietly craved his approval, even as I told myself I didn't need it. Hearing him say he was proud of me felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders, one I didn't even realize I'd been carrying. "Thanks, Dad," I said simply, and for the first time in a long time I felt like we truly understood each other. The months that followed were a whirlwind of change. I took time to travel, reconnect with old friends, and rediscover what it felt like to live without the constant weight of responsibility. It was strange at first, waking up without an endless to-do list or going to bed without the stress of a major decision looming over me. But slowly, I adjusted. As the company thrived under its new leadership, I began to dream about building something of my own. I wanted to take everything I'd learned, the mistakes, the victories, the late nights, and channel it into a new venture. Partnering with a few trusted friends, I launched a business that reflected my vision and values, a project I could truly call my own. Looking back, the journey wasn't easy. There were countless sacrifices, relationships that suffered, and moments when I doubted myself. But every setback taught me something valuable: resilience, humility, and the importance of staying true to your goals, no matter how daunting they seem. I don't talk to Ryan much these days, and that's okay. He's on his own path, and I've made my peace with how things turned out. Dad and I stay in touch more often now. Our relationship isn't perfect, but there's mutual respect, and that's enough for me. And as for the company, it's thriving. Watching it grow beyond anything I could have imagined is bittersweet but satisfying. I know I left it in good hands, built on a foundation of hard work and perseverance. In the end, saving my dad's company wasn't just about keeping his dream alive. It was about proving something to myself, that I could take something broken and make it whole again, that I could rise to the challenge, even when the odds were stacked against me. It's not about the accolades or the recognition. It's about knowing you gave it everything you had, that you did the best you could with what you were given. And for me, that's more than enough. This single, cohesive version ties everything together while maintaining the emotional depth and finality. Let me know if there's anything else you'd like to adjust. Story 3. My fiancé's shocking secret, a face tattoo that changed everything. When I first met Erin, I thought she was the kind of person who had her whole life together. She carried herself with confidence and had this no-nonsense attitude that instantly made you feel like you could trust her. Over the 6 years we'd been together, that trust had only deepened. So when she told me she wasn't feeling well and needed a few days to herself, I didn't think twice about it. Erin wasn't one for dramatics or lies. At least that's what I believed back then. She had taken 3 days off work, claiming she was sick, but looking back, the signs were there. Erin had avoided video calls, refused to meet her sister Laura for their weekly lunch, and barely texted me during the day. It felt off, but I figured everyone has their moments. Maybe she really was overwhelmed. I was used to trusting her implicitly. Erin had never given me a reason to question her, and it was part of what made me love her. Her family didn't seem alarmed either. Everyone just assumed she needed rest. By the 3rd day, Laura, who had grown increasingly concerned, decided to stop by unannounced. I was at work when it happened, but Laura later called me in a fluster. "She's done something insane, and you need to see it to believe it," she said, her voice a mix of shock and anger. When I walked into the apartment that evening, the air felt tense. Erin was sitting on the couch, her arms crossed tightly, as though she was bracing for impact. But what struck me immediately was her face. There it was, black ink etched into her forehead, running down under her eye in a series of Japanese characters. The tattoo looked swollen and painfully fresh, the redness spreading like an aura around the symbols. "I wanted to tell you," she said, breaking the silence. Her voice carried that defensive edge I'd only heard during our rare fights. "But I knew you'd try to talk me out of it." Talk her out of it? That was an understatement. I was floored. We'd been together 6 years, and not once had Erin ever brought up tattoos. She didn't even seem interested in them, not on herself or anyone else. And now this? A face tattoo? It wasn't just a shock, it felt like a betrayal of everything I thought I knew about her. "Why would you hide this from me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, though my head was spinning. "Erin, this isn't something small. This is your face." She shrugged, avoiding my gaze. "I've been planning it for months," she said. "I just didn't tell anyone because I didn't want anyone ruining it for me." It was a response I couldn't wrap my head around. How could she plan something this drastic without a word to me, or even Laura, who she usually confided in about everything? She went on to explain that the tattoo held deep artistic meaning for her, and that she was tired of living her life based on what others thought. But none of it made sense to me. Erin worked in a public-facing job at a financial firm, meeting clients every day. How did she think this was going to play out at work? And what about her family? Her parents were Japanese immigrants, deeply rooted in traditional values. Tattoos, especially in their culture, were often associated with crime and carried heavy stigma. "You've always been the stable one, Erin," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why now? Why this?" She didn't have a clear answer. All I got was a vague, "I needed to do this for myself." The more Erin tried to explain her decision, the more surreal the whole thing felt. She said she'd been feeling stifled lately, like everyone had expectations for who she should be and how she should act. "I just wanted to do something for me," she said, her tone a mix of defiance and self-justification. I tried to listen. Really, I did. But every word felt like another jab to the gut. For 6 years, we'd built a life based on trust and shared decisions. And now, without so much as a heads up, she'd gone and made a choice that could alter the course of her career, her relationships, and even our future together. It wasn't just about the tattoo itself, though that was shocking enough. The design, bold and unapologetic, consisted of several Japanese kanji symbols running vertically down her forehead and curving under her right eye. Erin's parents, both first-generation Japanese immigrants, would undoubtedly have strong feelings about this. In their culture, tattoos often carried associations with criminal activity or rebellion, something Erin had grown up fully aware of. To her, these symbols might hold personal artistic meaning, but to her parents, it would be a slap in the face. "What do they even mean?" I finally asked. gesturing toward the ink on her face. Erin hesitated. "They're about freedom and self-expression," she said vaguely, as if the exact translation didn't matter as much as the message she wanted them to convey. Laura's voice echoed in my mind, warning me that her parents were already in shock. Apparently her mom had broken down in tears when she saw Erin's face, and her dad had stormed out of the house, muttering something in Japanese that Laura didn't fully understand but knew wasn't good. I hadn't even processed my own feelings yet, and now I had to think about how this would ripple through her family, her workplace, and everything else we'd built together. But Erin wasn't done. "You're upset because you don't understand it," she said, her voice growing sharper. "I didn't tell you because I knew you'd react like this." "How am I supposed to react, Erin?" I shot back, my frustration finally spilling over. "You work with clients face to face. You meet people every day who are supposed to trust you with their money, and now you've got a face tattoo. Did you even think about how this would affect your job or your family or us?" She looked away, her jaw tightening. "It's my face," she said. "My choice." Her words hung in the air, heavy with finality. I wanted to yell, to demand answers, but I could see there was no getting through to her. In Erin's mind, this was her victory, her declaration of independence from the expectations of everyone around her. But to me, it felt like she'd torn apart the foundation of our relationship in one impulsive act. Later that night, as I sat on the couch scrolling aimlessly through my phone, a text from Laura popped up. "How's she doing?" it read. I wanted to reply honestly, to tell her that Erin was acting like a stranger, that I had no idea what to do anymore. But instead I typed, "She's fine," and left it at that. The truth was, I wasn't fine. I couldn't stop imagining the fallout. What would her boss say when she walked into work? Erin was a client-facing financial analyst. The firm she worked for had a strict dress code and prided itself on professionalism. There was no way they'd overlook a face tattoo, no matter how meaningful it was to her. And her parents. How would they ever forgive her? I'd seen firsthand how much they valued tradition and respectability. Her father had spent years working tirelessly to give Erin and Laura every opportunity, hoping they'd honor the sacrifices he'd made to move to this country. How would he reconcile this with the daughter he thought he knew? The next morning, Erin called her boss to break the news. I overheard parts of the conversation from the kitchen. She framed it as a step toward personal growth, using phrases like authenticity and artistic self-expression. I couldn't hear the response, but her face was grim when she hung up. "Well?" I asked, bracing for impact. "They're letting me take unpaid leave while they review their policy," she said, her voice tight. "It's not like I was going to stay there forever anyway." I stared at her, trying to process the fact that she'd jeopardized her entire career for this, but Erin just shrugged, as if losing her job was a minor inconvenience compared to the freedom she'd gained. Erin's decision didn't just affect her career, it sent shockwaves through her family too. Her parents, Keiko and Hiroshi, were deeply rooted in their Japanese heritage, and for them, the concept of respectability was paramount. They had worked tirelessly after immigrating to provide a stable life for Erin and Laura, teaching them the importance of tradition and pride in their culture. In their eyes, tattoos weren't just frowned upon, they were a symbol of rebellion and disgrace, often tied to criminal activity in Japanese culture. Laura had tried to soften the blow, but there was no easy way to explain to their parents that Erin now had ink permanently etched onto her face. When Keiko saw the tattoo for the first time, she burst into tears, her hands covering her mouth as if she could somehow undo what she'd seen. Hiroshi, normally a reserved man, couldn't even bring himself to look at Erin. Instead, he muttered something in Japanese, his voice low and laced with disappointment, before leaving the room entirely. Laura later told me she'd never seen him like that before. When I asked Erin about it, she shrugged it off. "They'll come around," she said, as if their dismay were some minor inconvenience. "They just need time to get used to it." But it wasn't that simple. Her parents didn't just see the tattoo as a personal choice. They saw it as a rejection of everything they had worked so hard to instill in her. And truth be told, I could see their point. This wasn't like dyeing your hair a bold color or getting a hidden tattoo where only a few people would ever notice. Erin had made a statement, one that was impossible to ignore. The tension at home grew unbearable. Keiko refused to speak to Erin directly, communicating only through Laura, and Hiroshi buried himself in work, avoiding family dinners altogether. For a while I felt like I was caught in the middle, trying to mediate between Erin's defiant independence and her parents' crushing disappointment. But the more I tried to talk to Erin about it, the more defensive she became. "They don't own me," she snapped one night after I suggested she apologize to her parents. "I'm not going to live my life for them, or for you for that matter." Her words stung more than I expected. For years I'd prided myself on being the supportive partner, the one who encouraged Erin to chase her dreams and make her own choices. But this felt like something else entirely. It wasn't about self-expression. It was about shutting out the people who cared about her the most. The fights between us became more frequent. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same argument. Erin insisting that this was her life and no one else's business, and me struggling to make her see the consequences of her actions. The worst part was, I wasn't even sure I knew who she was anymore. The Erin I fell in love with wouldn't have done something so drastic without at least talking it through with me first. One night, after another heated argument, Erin stormed out of the apartment. She didn't say where she was going, and I didn't bother asking. I sat on the couch for hours, staring at the door, half expecting her to come back and tell me she'd changed her mind about everything. But she didn't. When I finally went to bed, the apartment felt emptier than it ever had before. The next morning, I woke up to a string of messages from Laura. "She's not picking up my calls," one text read. "Dad says she's dead to him," said another. I could feel the weight of her family's heartbreak in every word. Erin had always been the golden child, the one her parents looked to with pride and hope. And now that image was shattered. When Erin finally came home, she acted like nothing had happened. She sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone as if we hadn't just had one of the worst fights of our relationship. I didn't know whether to be angry or heartbroken. "Your dad says he's done," I told her, breaking the silence. She looked up, her expression blank. "He'll get over it." "Will he?" I asked, my voice trembling with frustration. "Erin, this isn't just about you. Do you even care how much you've hurt them?" Her eyes narrowed. "I care about being true to myself," she said. "If they can't handle that, it's their problem, not mine." That was the moment I realized how far apart we'd drifted. The Erin sitting in front of me wasn't the person I'd fallen in love with. She was someone I barely recognized, someone who valued her own independence above everything else, even if it meant burning bridges with the people who loved her most. The days that followed felt like living in a constant state of tension, as if the air itself had grown heavier. Erin's parents weren't speaking to her, and even Laura seemed to be pulling back. For someone who claimed she didn't care what others thought, Erin seemed strangely fixated on defending her decision. Every conversation turned into a debate about freedom, authenticity, and how everyone else was too narrow-minded to understand her. But the truth was, it wasn't just about the tattoo anymore. It was about the cracks that had started forming in our relationship long before the ink touched her skin. This decision had become the flashpoint for something much bigger, a fundamental difference in how we viewed life, family, and partnership. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the gap between us was growing too wide to bridge. Then came the night that everything unraveled. Erin and I were sitting in the living room, each of us lost in our own thoughts. She was scrolling through her phone as usual while I was staring blankly at the TV. The silence between us felt oppressive, like a storm waiting to break. Finally, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Do you even regret it?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. She glanced at me, her expression unreadable. "Regret what?" "This," I said, gesturing vaguely at her face. "The tattoo, the fallout, all of it." She put her phone down and leaned back against the couch. "No," she said simply, "I don't." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd been clinging to the hope that, deep down, she might feel some remorse, that maybe this was just a phase, something we could work through together. but her unwavering defiance made it clear. Erin wasn't looking back, and she wasn't planning to compromise. "You don't regret losing your job?" I pressed. "Or hurting your parents? Or what this is doing to us?" She sighed, as if my questions were exhausting her. "I didn't lose my job," she said. "I'm on leave. And as for my parents, they'll come around eventually. They always do." "And us?" I asked, my voice breaking slightly. Her eyes softened for the first time in weeks. "I love you," she said, "but I need you to love me for who I am, not for who you want me to be." It was a nice sentiment, but it felt hollow. The person sitting across from me wasn't the Erin I'd fallen in love with. That Erin had been thoughtful, considerate, and deeply connected to the people around her. This Erin seemed determined to push everyone away, all in the name of authenticity. The fight that followed was the worst one yet. Words were said that couldn't be taken back. I accused her of being selfish, reckless, and blind to the consequences of her actions. She called me controlling, unsupportive, and unwilling to accept her for who she truly was. By the end of it, we were both yelling, our voices echoing through the apartment like gunshots. And then, just like that, it was over. Erin grabbed her coat and walked out the door, slamming it behind her. I didn't follow. I just sat there, staring at the empty space where she'd been, wondering how we'd gotten to this point. The next morning, I woke up to find her engagement ring sitting on the kitchen counter. Beside it was a small box filled with the things I'd given her over the years. Notes, trinkets, little reminders of the life we'd built together. There was no note, no explanation. Just silence. I tried calling her, but my number was blocked. Laura said she hadn't heard from her either, and her parents were still refusing to talk to her. It was as if Erin had vanished, cutting ties with everyone who had once been part of her world. At first I was angry, furious even. How could she walk away so easily? How could she throw everything away without even trying to fix it? But as the days turned into weeks, my anger gave way to something else. A deep, aching sadness. The woman I'd loved was gone, and there was nothing I could do to bring her back. In the weeks following Erin's departure, life became a blur of routines and empty spaces. I'd go to work, come home, and sit in the quiet apartment that still held faint traces of her. Her favorite blanket on the couch, the mug she always used for coffee, and the faint smell of her perfume lingering in the closet. Each reminder felt like a small wound reopening, but I couldn't bring myself to pack her things away. It was as if doing so would make her absence permanent, a reality I wasn't ready to accept. I threw myself into work, hoping that staying busy would dull the pain. But no amount of distraction could stop the questions that haunted me. Had I overreacted? Could I have been more supportive? Was this my fault? Over and over, I replayed our last argument, trying to pinpoint the moment when everything had gone irreparably wrong. Laura checked in on me occasionally, though I could tell she was dealing with her own version of the fallout. Erin hadn't contacted her since leaving, and their parents were still too hurt to discuss the situation. "She's stubborn," Laura said during one of our conversations. "She'll come around eventually. She always does." But even she didn't sound convinced. A month after Erin left, I finally heard from her. Not directly, but through a mutual friend who had seen her at a cafe on the other side of town. According to them, she looked different, happier, freer, as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or resentful. While I was here trying to piece my life back together, she seemed to have moved on without a second thought. Still, I couldn't bring myself to hate her. Erin's decision had hurt me deeply, but I knew it hadn't been an easy one for her either. She'd made a choice to prioritize herself, to break free from the expectations of everyone around her, and while I couldn't understand it, I had to respect it. Maybe she'd find the happiness she was looking for. Maybe she already had. As for me, I started taking small steps toward rebuilding my own life. I reached out to friends I hadn't seen in years, reconnected with my family, and even started therapy to work through the tangled mess of emotions Erin had left behind. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the sadness felt overwhelming. But slowly, I began to see glimpses of a future that didn't revolve around her. The turning point came when I decided to clear out the apartment. It was time to let go of the physical reminders of our relationship, the photos, the notes, the little trinkets that once held so much meaning. I packed everything into a box and left it with Laura, asking her to hold on to it in case Aaron ever wanted it back. It was a small act of closure, but it felt significant. For the first time in months, I felt like I was reclaiming my space, my life, and my sense of self. Looking back, I can't say I regret the years I spent with Erin. She taught me a lot about love, about trust, and about the importance of staying true to yourself, even when it's hard. But she also taught me that relationships can't survive without communication and compromise, and that sometimes loving someone means letting them go. I don't know where Erin is now or what she's doing. Part of me hopes she's found what she was looking for, while another part hopes she'll reach out one day so we can have the conversation we never finished. But until then, I'm moving forward, one step at a time, one day at a time. The world feels different now, both emptier and fuller at the same time. Emptier because she's gone, but fuller because I've learned that I can stand on my own. And for the first time in a long time, that feels like enough. Story 4. How I escaped my sister's shadow and found myself. Growing up, my sister Rose, 5 years older than me, made my childhood a minefield of emotional turmoil. From the moment I was born, her resentment toward me was painfully clear. For her, my arrival meant a permanent shift in the family dynamics. Diagnosed with ADHD early on, Rose's hyperactivity and impulsiveness often spiraled out of control. While my parents showered her with patience and understanding, I became the easiest scapegoat for her frustrations. From as far back as I can remember, Rose dominated the household. As a toddler, I'd sit quietly playing with my toys, only for her to storm in, grab them, and claim them as her own. I'd cry for help, but my parents would dismiss it with a quick, "She's just playing, let her be." The truth was, she wasn't playing. She was bullying. It became an unspoken rule that Rose could do whatever she pleased without consequence. Birthdays were supposed to be special, but for me they became exercises in humiliation. One year I was so excited to have my friends over for a party. I had spent days planning the games and imagining the laughter and fun. Instead, Rose threw a tantrum right before the party began, wailing about how she felt excluded. My parents, in their desperation to placate her, ended up involving her in every single activity. She clung to the spotlight while I was left in the background, watching my special day slip away. The older I got, the worse it became. By age 6, her bullying had escalated beyond stealing toys and throwing tantrums. She started shoving me when no one was looking and biting me during arguments. These weren't minor spats. They were deliberate acts of aggression. Once, when I tried to sit on the couch to watch my favorite cartoon, she pushed me so hard that I hit my head on the coffee table. I ran crying to my parents, expecting comfort and justice. But all they said was, "You need to understand how hard it is for Rose. She doesn't mean to hurt you." Their words became a refrain. "She doesn't mean it. She can't help it. And you're the younger one. You need to be patient." But what about me? I was too young to understand favoritism, but I felt its sting in every interaction. No one seemed to notice how much I was shrinking into myself, how the constant dismissal of my feelings made me feel unworthy of love and attention. There were countless moments where I tried to fight back, but they only seemed to reinforce my role as the problem child. One Christmas, I received a beautiful art set, a rare gift that was just for me. I spent hours carefully painting a picture of a snowy landscape. When Rose saw it, she grabbed it from my hands and ripped it to shreds. "You think you're better than me?" she sneered. I ran to my parents, tears streaming down my face, clutching the torn pieces of my artwork. Instead of scolding her, they told me, "You should have shared it with her. She doesn't have many hobbies like you do." My small attempts to find joy were always overshadowed by Rose's disruptions. She didn't just want attention, she demanded complete control. At school, I envied kids who talked about their supportive siblings, brothers and sisters who cheered them on at games or helped with homework. I longed for that bond, but with Rose, It was impossible. She didn't just resent me, she seemed to hate me for existing. By the time I turned 8, I started to realize that my parents' excuses for Rose were more than just favoritism. They were a way for them to avoid confronting the truth. They saw her as fragile, someone who needed constant coddling, and I was the collateral damage. They didn't see the bruises on my arms from her shoves or the way I'd flinch whenever she raised her voice. All they saw was a child who needed their protection, no matter how much harm she caused. Every night, I lay in bed clutching my stuffed bear, wishing for someone to notice me. I fantasized about running away, imagining a world where I wasn't constantly pushed aside or told to sacrifice my happiness for Rose's sake. But I was just a child, trapped in a cycle of neglect and overshadowed by a sister who couldn't or wouldn't see the damage she was causing. As Rose entered her teenage years, her behavior grew even more erratic, and the imbalance in our family dynamic deepened. Rose had trouble making friends, so my parents often organized playdates for her, hoping she'd find someone who understood her. But instead of helping, these gatherings became a new arena for her to assert control. I was often roped into these events, expected to mediate or keep her entertained when things went wrong. One time my parents invited a neighbor's child over, a shy girl named Emily. I was thrilled, thinking I might finally have someone to play with who wasn't Rose. But within minutes, Rose dominated the visit, demanding Emily's attention and ridiculing me for wanting to join in. When Emily started crying after Rose threw a tantrum, my parents didn't address Rose's behavior. Instead, they told me to be a good little brother and make things easier for her. By the time I was 13, my frustration had turned to anger. I tried to assert myself more, hoping my parents would notice how unfairly I was being treated, but every attempt backfired. One of the most vivid memories I have is of my 13th birthday. For months I had begged my parents to let me have a trip, just the three of us, to Disneyland. It was all I wanted, and after much pleading, they finally agreed. They assured me it would be my special day, a rare opportunity to feel like I mattered. But when Rose found out about the plan, everything fell apart. She threw one of her infamous tantrums, screaming that I was stealing our parents from her and that she deserved to go too. The meltdown lasted hours. She cursed, threw objects, and even threatened me, saying, "If you leave without me, I'll make your life miserable when you get back." Rather than standing firm, my parents caved. They begged me to let her come along, claiming it was the only way to keep the peace. Reluctantly, I agreed, knowing deep down that my dream trip would never happen as I imagined. And I was right. From the moment we arrived at Disneyland, Rose made sure the trip was anything but magical. She refused to ride any of the attractions, clung to my mother like a shadow, and complained incessantly about the crowds and noise. Her behavior drew attention everywhere we went, turning heads as she shouted at the staff or burst into tears over the smallest inconveniences. My parents spent the entire trip soothing her, leaving me to wander alone. What hurt the most wasn't just the ruined trip. It was the realization that my happiness would always come second to Rose's demands. I was the afterthought, the child who had to sacrifice his joy to maintain the fragile balance in our family. At school, things weren't much better. Teachers praised me for being quiet and responsible, unaware of the chaos waiting at home. My classmates talked about their siblings with pride, sharing stories of their support and camaraderie. I stayed silent, embarrassed to admit that my sister was nothing like theirs. She wasn't my ally, she was my tormentor. One particularly harsh winter, I had worked tirelessly on a science project, a carefully constructed volcano that erupted with colored baking soda and vinegar. It was my pride and joy, a symbol of the creativity I tried so hard to nurture in the shadow of Rose's chaos. The night before I was supposed to bring it to school, Rose destroyed it. She knocked it off the table by accident, but the smirk on her face told me otherwise. When I confronted her, she shrugged and said, "It wasn't that good anyway." My parents, true to form, brushed it off, telling me to rebuild it and not make such a big deal. These moments piled up like bricks, building a wall of resentment that I couldn't ignore. I longed for a home where I wasn't constantly overlooked, where I didn't have to walk on eggshells to avoid triggering Rose's outbursts. I wanted a family that saw me for who I was, a child with his own needs, not just an accessory to Rose's life. The older I got, the clearer it became that my parents weren't going to change. They were trapped in a cycle of enabling Rose, and I was collateral damage. While other kids my age were navigating the usual teenage milestones, first crushes, school dances, and late-night talks with friends, I was learning to survive in a household that didn't see me. By the time I was 16, I had stopped trying to please my parents. Their constant excuses for Rose and their dismissal of my feelings had eroded any hope I had for a close relationship with them. Instead, I turned inward, focusing on school and dreaming of the day I could leave. The resentment I harbored toward Rose was matched only by the deep sense of betrayal I felt from my parents. Every night as I lay in bed, I imagined a life beyond those walls, a life where I could finally be free from the constant comparisons, the excuses, and the feeling of being invisible. By the time I turned 18, the weight of my family's dysfunction had become unbearable. For years, I had tolerated being sidelined and sacrificed, but I finally realized that staying in that environment would only continue to erode my sense of self-worth. I knew I had to leave. On my birthday, I packed my belongings into a battered suitcase I had bought at a thrift store. I didn't say goodbye to Rose or my parents. I left a simple note on the kitchen counter. "I need to find myself. Please don't follow me." Then I walked out the door, leaving behind the only life I'd ever known. At first, freedom felt exhilarating. I moved into a cramped studio apartment on the edge of the city, paying rent with the money I'd saved from working odd jobs during high school. It wasn't much, but it was mine. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to tiptoe around someone else's emotions or make myself small to avoid conflict. I took on 2 part-time jobs to make ends meet, one at a local coffee shop and another stocking shelves at a grocery store. The work was exhausting, but it gave me a sense of purpose. Each paycheck felt like a victory, a reminder that I could stand on my own 2 feet. Despite the newfound freedom, the scars of my upbringing lingered. I carried a deep sense of inadequacy, the result of years spent in Rose's shadow. Socializing was hard. I often second-guessed myself in conversations, wondering if people saw me as invisible, just like my parents had. Making friends felt like an impossible task. But slowly, things began to change. At the coffee shop, I bonded with a coworker named Jake, whose easygoing nature made him approachable. He'd often crack jokes during our shifts, and one day he invited me to a trivia night at a local bar. I hesitated, but his persistence won me over. That night, for the first time in years, I laughed freely and felt a sense of belonging. Jake introduced me to his circle of friends, a group of quirky, kind-hearted people who welcomed me without judgment. They didn't know my past, and they didn't care. For them, I was just me, not Rose's brother, or the forgotten child. Being around them felt like a breath of fresh air. Over the next few years, I started to rebuild my sense of self. I enrolled in community college, using a mix of scholarships and my hard-earned savings to pay for classes. Education became my refuge, a place where I could focus on my passions and envision a future that was entirely my own. I excelled in my studies, driven by a desire to prove, to myself, if no one else, that I was capable of great things. Still, the specter of my family haunted me. My parents occasionally sent letters, their words filled with guilt and longing. They wanted me to come home, to reconcile with Rose, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. Every time I saw their names on the return address, a wave of anger and sadness washed over me. How could they expect me to return to the same toxic environment that had driven me away? Rose's attempts to reach out were less frequent but equally complicated. She'd send messages through social media, often laced with vague apologies and casual mentions of her struggles. Part of me wanted to forgive her, to believe that she had changed, but another part of me couldn't forget the years of pain she had caused. As I navigated this new chapter of my life, I found solace in therapy. My counselor helped me unpack the trauma of my childhood and challenged me to let go of the guilt I carried. "You are not responsible for fixing your family," she told me. "You have the right to prioritize your own well-being." Those words became a mantra, a guiding light as I worked to heal. One of the most liberating moments came when I changed my phone number and blocked my parents and Rose on social media. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was necessary. For the first time, I felt fully in control of my life. Over time, I found joy in the small things: the warmth of a sunny day, the satisfaction of completing a challenging assignment, the laughter shared with friends over a board game. These moments, though ordinary, felt extraordinary to someone who had spent so long living in the shadow of chaos. Leaving home wasn't just about escaping Rose's toxicity, it was about discovering who I was outside of that environment. I realized that I wasn't weak for leaving. I was strong for choosing myself. 6 years had passed since I left home, and in that time I had built a life that was mine alone. I was living in a modest but comfortable apartment, working a steady job, and even considering pursuing a master's degree. I finally felt like I was in control of my own narrative. But just when I thought I had left the past behind, my parents reached out again, this time with an urgent plea. Their email arrived late one evening, its subject line stark and to the point: "Rose needs help." I hesitated before opening it, my stomach knotting with a mix of dread and curiosity. The message detailed how Rose's life had spiraled out of control. Her impulsiveness had led her to financial ruin, and she was now facing serious legal troubles. My parents were desperate for me to step in and help her. "Family sticks together," they wrote, as if those 3 words could erase the years of pain and neglect I had endured. They went on to explain that Rose was sorry for how she had treated me, and that this was a chance for us to rebuild our relationship. Their tone was pleading, almost manipulative, and it left me torn. Part of me wanted to ignore the message entirely, to preserve the hard-earned peace I had found. But another part of me, the part that still longed for my parents' approval, felt compelled to respond. I decided to meet them in person, more out of curiosity than a genuine desire to reconcile. The meeting was arranged at a small cafe near my old neighborhood. When I arrived, my parents were already seated, looking older and wearier than I remembered. Rose was there too, sitting between them with a hesitant smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you for coming," my mother said, her voice filled with relief. My father nodded, his expression a mix of hope and apprehension. Rose was the first to speak. "I'm sorry," she said, her words awkward and rushed, "for everything I did to you. I know I made your life hard, and I wish I could take it back." Her apology felt hollow, like something she had rehearsed for their benefit rather than mine. I glanced at my parents, who were watching me intently, waiting for me to respond. "I appreciate the apology," I said carefully, "but you can't undo years of damage with a few words." My mother jumped in, her tone defensive. "She's been through a lot, you know. It's not easy for her." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. "And what about me?" I asked. "Do you have any idea what it was like to grow up feeling invisible? To always come second to Rose's needs?" They exchanged uncomfortable glances, but neither offered an answer. It was clear they hadn't come to address the past. They just wanted me to help clean up Rose's mess. Rose shifted in her seat, her expression shifting between guilt and frustration. "I'm trying to change," she said quietly. "I just need some support." Her words might have moved me years ago, but now they felt like too little, too late. I had spent my entire life supporting her, often at the expense of my own well-being. I wasn't about to fall back into that role. "I'm sorry," I said, standing up, "but I can't be the one to save you. You need to take responsibility for your own life." My parents started to protest, but I cut them off. "I'll help financially if it's absolutely necessary, but that's it. I can't go back to the way things were." Walking away from that meeting was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but it was also one of the most liberating. For the first time, I stood up for myself and set boundaries that I refused to compromise. The aftermath was difficult. My parents sent several follow-up messages, trying to guilt me into re-engaging. But I held firm. I had spent too long sacrificing my happiness for others, and I wasn't going to let them pull me back into that cycle. Rose eventually stopped reaching out, and my parents' attempts to reconnect dwindled. It hurt to let go of the idea of a family that truly cared for me, but it was a necessary step toward healing. Walking away from my family wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. At first, I struggled with the weight of my decision. Doubts crept in during quiet moments, whispering that I had abandoned them, that I should have tried harder to bridge the gap. But therapy became my lifeline. My counselor reminded me that choosing myself wasn't selfish, it was survival. In the months after that final meeting, I poured my energy into building a life that felt authentic to me. I focused on my friendships, my education, and the small joys that made life worth living. Jake and our group of friends became my chosen family, people who supported and celebrated me without strings attached. For the first time, I allowed myself to dream without limits. I applied for a promotion at work, a position I'd hesitated to pursue because of the fear that I wasn't good enough. To my surprise, I got it. The validation was like a balm for the wounds left by years of feeling unseen. As time passed, the pain of my past began to feel less sharp. I no longer flinched at memories of Rose's bullying or my parents' neglect. Instead, I saw them as chapters in a book I had outgrown. They were part of my story, but they didn't define me. One day, I received a letter from my mother. It was handwritten, the kind of effort she rarely made when I was younger. In it, she expressed regret for how they had treated me and admitted that they had failed to protect me from Rose's actions. "We thought we were doing the right thing by prioritizing her needs," she wrote, "but in doing so, we ignored yours. I'm sorry for that." I read the letter twice, unsure how to feel. It was the acknowledgement I had craved for so long, but it also stirred old wounds. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I tucked the letter into a drawer and gave myself time to process. In therapy, I unpacked my feelings about the letter. My counselor helped me see that forgiveness didn't have to mean reconciliation. I could forgive my parents for their mistakes without reopening the door to the toxic dynamics of the past. Months later, I wrote back. My response was brief but heartfelt. I thanked my mother for her apology and shared that I was doing well, but I made it clear that I needed to maintain the boundaries I had set. It wasn't the reconciliation she might have hoped for, but it was the closure I needed. As for Rose, I haven't heard from her since that cafe meeting. Part of me wonders if she's managed to turn her life around, but I no longer feel responsible for her choices. Letting go of that burden has been one of the most freeing experiences of my life. In the years since, I've learned to celebrate my own victories without seeking validation from others. Whether it's a promotion at work, a personal milestone, or simply a quiet moment of peace, I've come to recognize my own worth. The scars of my childhood haven't disappeared, but they've become a part of the tapestry of my life. They remind me of where I've been, but they don't dictate where I'm going. I've found strength in my resilience and joy in the freedom to be myself. Looking back, I don't regret leaving. It was the hardest decision I've ever made, but it was also the best. My journey has been one of self-discovery, healing, and learning to value myself in a way my family never did. And for that, I will always be grateful. Story 5. I discovered my wife's secret divorce plans, so I protected myself before she filed. When I look back on the past year, I can't help but wonder how I missed the warning signs. My wife, Samantha, and I had been married for 4 years, together for 6. From the outside, we were the couple everyone envied, partners in every sense of the word. We shared laughs, debated over who made the best pancakes. Spoiler, it was always her, and even planned elaborate surprises for each other on birthdays and anniversaries. Ours wasn't a fairy tale, but it felt real. Solid. That's why what happened caught me so completely off guard. It all began about 6 months ago. At first, the changes were subtle, so small that at the time I didn't even think to question them. Samantha started keeping her phone close, even when she was just moving around the house. This was unusual. Before, she'd leave it on the kitchen counter for hours without a care. One day I made a joke, something like, "Are you secretly running a CIA operation?" She just laughed and said work emails had been piling up. I didn't press her about it. It seemed harmless enough. But then, out of the blue, she set a password on her phone. That threw me for a loop. We'd always been open about everything: passwords, schedules, plans. So when I casually asked her why she needed one now, she muttered something about hackers and security updates. Again, I brushed it off, though I couldn't shake the nagging thought that something was off. Things didn't stop there. Samantha began stepping out to take calls. Calls she wouldn't explain. "Oh, it's just Susan from work," she'd say, shrugging when I asked. And then there was the night she told me she had plans to meet an old friend for coffee. It wasn't unusual. She was a social butterfly, always making time for her friends. But as luck would have it, I happened to be in the same area running errands. I thought it'd be a nice surprise to swing by and say hello. Instead, I found Samantha pacing outside the cafe, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. She was speaking in hushed tones, glancing around as though she didn't want anyone overhearing. I couldn't catch much, but two phrases stood out. "It's almost done," and "starting fresh." My stomach twisted into a knot. When she came home that evening, I kept my cool. "How was coffee with your friend?" I asked, keeping my tone light. Samantha smiled and launched into a detailed story about how her friend had been venting about relationship drama. Her words seemed rehearsed, though, like she'd been practicing them. I nodded, pretending to believe her while my mind raced. Something wasn't adding up. The next few weeks felt like walking through quicksand. Samantha's behavior became even more guarded. Our conversations, once so effortless, now felt forced, like she was holding something back. She even started avoiding discussions about our future, plans for our anniversary, ideas for a vacation. Every time I brought it up, she'd just say, "We'll see," and change the subject. I tried to convince myself I was overthinking things. Maybe work really was stressing her out, or maybe she was just going through a phase. I told myself that relationships had ups and downs, and this was just one of those dips. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. The breaking point came during one of our quiet dinners. Out of nowhere, Samantha brought up our finances. "We should really get everything organized," she said, flashing me a sweet, almost too innocent smile. She suggested consolidating accounts, updating documents, and ensuring everything was in order, just in case. The way she said it made my skin crawl. Just in case of what? I tried to probe her a bit. "What brought this on?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. Samantha shrugged. "It's just good to be prepared, you know? You never know what could happen." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. That night, as I lay awake, the pieces started falling into place. Her secretive phone calls, the guarded conversations, the sudden obsession with finances. It was like staring at a puzzle where the final image was coming into focus, and the picture it painted wasn't good. I decided then and there that I needed to protect myself. If Samantha was planning something, and I was starting to suspect it involved a divorce, I wasn't going to be caught off guard. The next morning I made an excuse to leave for work early. Instead of heading to the office right away, I went to see an attorney. I wasn't sure what I was looking for exactly: advice, reassurance, a reality check. But I needed to do something. The attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Laura, listened patiently as I laid out my suspicions. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and gave me a thoughtful look. "You're smart to come in now," she said. "If your gut is telling you something's wrong, it probably is. The best thing you can do is get ahead of it." She walked me through my options, explaining how to protect my assets and prepare for the possibility of a split. It felt surreal, sitting there discussing the end of my marriage when I wasn't even sure it was ending. But something told me I'd regret it if I didn't take her advice. When I got home that evening, Samantha was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she made dinner. She looked so normal, so familiar, that for a moment I wondered if I was making a mountain out of a molehill. But then she glanced up and caught me watching her. There was a flicker of something in her expression. Guilt, maybe, or fear. It was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but it was enough to remind me why I had gone to see Laura in the first place. In the days that followed, I started paying closer attention to Samantha's behavior. Not in an overt way. I didn't want her to know I was watching. But in those quiet, in-between moments where people let their guard down, every little action, every pause in conversation seemed loaded with meaning. I hated feeling like a stranger in my own marriage, but I couldn't shake the suspicion that I was being played. One afternoon, while Samantha was at work, I decided to go through some of our shared documents. I told myself it was just to stay informed, but deep down, I was looking for anything that might confirm my fears. Bank statements, investment portfolios, even old emails. I scoured through them all. At first, everything seemed normal, but then I noticed something strange. A series of small but regular withdrawals from our joint account, always on the same day of the month. They weren't large enough to raise red flags, but they added up. I couldn't think of a single reason Samantha would need to withdraw cash so often, especially when she used her debit card for everything. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Was she hiding money? Paying for something she didn't want me to know about? The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that these withdrawals were part of whatever she was planning. That evening, I tried to act normal as we ate dinner together. Samantha chatted about her day, smiling and laughing like nothing had changed. It was unnerving how easily she could slip into that role, the loving wife, the perfect partner, when I was starting to see cracks in the facade. After dinner, she went upstairs to take a shower, leaving her phone on the kitchen counter. It was the first time in months I'd seen it out of her sight. My heart raced as I stared at it, debating whether to pick it up. I hated the idea of snooping, but if she was keeping secrets, didn't I have a right to know? Finally, I reached for the phone, my hands trembling. To my disappointment, the screen was locked, and I didn't have the password. I put it back exactly where she'd left it, cursing myself for even trying. But as I turned to leave, a notification popped up on the screen, a text from someone named Lila. The message preview read, "Let's confirm the transfer tomorrow. Can't wait to start fresh." My blood ran cold. I didn't recognize the name, and the message sounded suspiciously like it had nothing to do with work. Samantha came downstairs a few minutes later, her hair wrapped in a towel. She spotted her phone and picked it up immediately, her expression unreadable as she checked the screen. "Everything okay?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. She nodded, giving me a quick smile. "Yeah, just Lila from work. She's helping me with a project." I didn't believe her for a second. That night, I started thinking about how to dig deeper without tipping her off. I didn't want to confront her without solid evidence. If I was wrong, it could destroy our relationship. But if I was right, I needed to protect myself. The next day, I met with Laura again. I told her about the withdrawals and the text message, and she nodded like she'd seen this 100 times before. "It sounds like she's planning to separate finances," Laura said. "If that's the case, you need to act fast." She gave me a list of steps to take. Open a new account in my name only, move a portion of our savings into it, and make copies of all important documents. It felt underhanded, but Laura assured me it was just precautionary. "Think of it as insurance," she said. "You're not doing anything wrong, you're just making sure you're not left vulnerable." Over the next few days, I followed Laura's advice to the letter. I opened a new account and moved enough money to cover my expenses for several months. I also started documenting everything: conversations with Samantha, unusual behavior, financial discrepancies. It felt strange, like I was building a case against my own wife, but I couldn't afford to ignore the signs. Meanwhile, Samantha seemed oblivious to my growing doubts. She continued acting as though everything was fine, but I noticed little slips, moments when she seemed distracted or hesitant. Once I caught her staring at me from across the room, her expression unreadable. When I asked what was on her mind, she just shook her head and said, "Nothing." One night, as we were getting ready for bed, she brought up the idea of selling the house. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Maybe it's time we downsized. We don't really need all this space, and it would free up some money." The suggestion caught me off guard. We'd talked about moving eventually, but it had always been part of a long-term plan. something to consider years down the line. "Why now?" I asked. Samantha hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying. "It just seems practical. You know, with the economy the way it is." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Just something to think about." I nodded, pretending to consider her suggestion, but alarm bells were going off in my head. Selling the house would make it easier for her to split assets if she was planning a divorce. It was the final piece of the puzzle, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I couldn't sleep that night. Samantha's suggestion to sell the house echoed in my mind, each word replaying like a drumbeat. This wasn't just about downsizing. It was about dismantling the life we'd built together. I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts running wild. Every smile, every shared moment, every memory. Was it all a lie? Had she been planning this all along? The next morning, I decided to test the waters. Over breakfast, I brought up the house. "I was thinking about what you said last night," I began, keeping my tone casual. "Selling could be a good idea, but it feels a bit sudden. Do you really think it's the right time?" Samantha barely looked up from her coffee. "I don't know," she said, her voice light. "It's just something I've been thinking about. No rush. No rush." The phrase felt like a cover, a way to buy time while she finalized her plans. I nodded, letting the conversation drop, but inside my resolve hardened. I needed to know the truth, and I wasn't going to get it by playing along. That afternoon I took a half-day off work and drove to a private investigator Laura had recommended. His name was Greg, a wiry man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. I explained my suspicions, laying out everything I'd noticed over the past few months. Greg listened without interrupting, jotting down notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and gave me a measured look. "You've got enough red flags here to start a parade," he said. "I'll take the case, but I need to warn you. If she's hiding something, there's a good chance you're not going to like what I find." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I just need to know," I said. "Whatever it is." Greg got to work immediately, starting with Samantha's phone records. He also planned to look into her financial transactions and track her movements over the next few weeks. It felt invasive, even cruel, but I told myself it was necessary. I couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. Back at home, Samantha was as cheerful as ever. She greeted me with a kiss and asked about my day, her smile so genuine it made me doubt everything. Could someone really be this deceitful and still act so normal? The thought made my stomach churn. As the days turned into weeks, I started noticing more cracks in Samantha's facade. She became increasingly preoccupied, spending long hours on her laptop or stepping out to take phone calls. Once I overheard her whispering in the hallway, her voice low and urgent. When I walked into the room, she snapped her phone shut and smiled at me like nothing had happened. "Who was that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Oh, just Lila," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "She's been having some issues at work, and I've been helping her out." I nodded, pretending to accept her answer, but inside, my suspicions deepened. I hadn't heard her mention Lila before the text message, and now it seemed like she was always talking to her. Whoever Lila was, she was clearly more than just a casual work acquaintance. A week later, Greg called with his first update. "I've been looking into Lila," he said. "Turns out she's not a coworker, she's a divorce attorney." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd suspected Samantha was planning something, but hearing it confirmed was another matter entirely. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Positive," Greg said. "I also found out where some of those cash withdrawals have been going. She's been paying Lila under the table, probably to keep things quiet." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. This wasn't just paranoia or overthinking. Samantha was actively preparing to end our marriage, and she was trying to do it without me noticing. "What do I do now?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Play it cool," Greg advised. "Don't let her know you're onto her. The more time she thinks she has, the more we can uncover. In the meantime, start thinking about what you want out of this. If it comes to a divorce, you need to be clear about your priorities." I hung up the phone, my hands trembling. My first instinct was to confront Samantha, to demand answers, but I knew Greg was right. If I tipped her off, she could cover her tracks or make things even messier. I needed to be patient, no matter how much it hurt. That night, I sat across from Samantha at the dinner table, watching as she laughed at a story she'd read online. Her smile was radiant, her laughter genuine. It was almost enough to make me forget everything Greg had told me. Almost. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope. I went through the motions of my daily life pretending everything was fine, while beneath the surface my world was crumbling. Samantha, oblivious to my discoveries, continued her routine as if nothing was wrong. She smiled at me over breakfast, kissed me goodbye as I left for work, and curled up next to me on the couch in the evenings. It was all so painfully normal, and yet every moment felt like a lie. Greg continued his investigation, feeding me bits of information that only confirmed what I already suspected. Samantha wasn't just consulting a divorce attorney, she was also discreetly moving money into an account under her name. The cash withdrawals I'd noticed were just the tip of the iceberg. She'd also been selling small items, things I hadn't even noticed were missing. A few pieces of jewelry, an old watch I'd given her as a gift, even some furniture she claimed to have donated. "She's building a financial safety net," Greg explained during one of our calls. "It's a classic move in cases like this. She wants to make sure she's covered when she files." The word files made my stomach turn. It was one thing to suspect Samantha was planning a divorce. It was another to hear it laid out so plainly. I wanted to believe there was some other explanation, some misunderstanding that would make all of this go away. But the evidence was piling up, and denial was no longer an option. One evening, as Samantha and I were watching TV, she casually mentioned that she'd be working late the next day. "Big project coming up," she said, stretching and yawning. "It's going to be a long night." I nodded, feigning indifference, but my mind was already racing. Late nights at the office were rare for her, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just work. The next day I called Greg and asked him to follow her. That night I sat at home pretending to read a book while my phone rested on the coffee table. Every few minutes I'd glance at the screen, waiting for an update. Around 9 p.m., Greg called. "She's not at the office," he said. "She's at a restaurant downtown. Looks like she's meeting with Lila." My heart sank. I thanked Greg and hung up, my hands shaking. Samantha had lied to me. Again. And this time, there was no room for doubt. She was meeting with her divorce attorney, probably finalizing the details of her plan to leave me. When Samantha came home later that night, she looked tired but cheerful. "Long day," she said, dropping her bag by the door. "I'm going to take a shower and head to bed." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Sounds good." As soon as she disappeared down the hall, I grabbed her bag and rifled through it. My hands moved quickly, searching for anything that might confirm what Greg had told me. In one of the side pockets, I found a folder. Inside were printed emails and handwritten notes, all detailing her plans to separate our finances and move out of the house. There was even a tentative timeline. She planned to file in 2 weeks. I stared at the papers, my chest tightening. It was real. Everything I'd feared was real. Samantha was planning to leave me, and she wasn't even giving me the courtesy of a conversation. She was going to blindside me, just like she'd blindsided me with her lies. That night I barely slept. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to confront Samantha right then and there, to demand an explanation for her betrayal. But I knew that would only make things worse. If I wanted to protect myself, I had to stay calm and think strategically. The next morning, I called Laura and told her everything. She listened patiently, offering reassurance and advice. "You're in a good position," she said. "You've taken the right steps to protect yourself. Now it's just a matter of waiting for her to make her move." Waiting. It was the last thing I wanted to do, but I knew Laura was right. If I acted too soon, I could lose the advantage. so I swallowed my anger and carried on as if nothing was wrong. Over the next few days, I began making quiet preparations. I moved more money into my private account, updated the passwords on my personal devices, and secured important documents in a safe deposit box. I also started packing a few essentials, a suitcase with clothes, toiletries, and anything else I might need if things escalated quickly. It felt strange, almost surreal, to be preparing for the collapse of my marriage while Samantha went about her day as if nothing had changed. One evening, as I was sorting through some old papers in the attic, I found a photo album from our wedding. Flipping through the pages, I felt a pang of nostalgia for the life we'd once shared. There we were, smiling and carefree, surrounded by friends and family. It was hard to reconcile the woman in those photos with the one who was now plotting behind my back. I wondered if she felt the same way, if she ever looked at those pictures and questioned her choices. But then I remembered the folder in her bag, the meetings with Lila, the lies she'd told me. Whatever love we'd shared, it clearly wasn't enough to stop her from doing this. And as much as it hurt, I knew I couldn't let my feelings cloud my judgment. Samantha had made her decision, and now I had to make mine. The days leading up to Samantha's expected move were some of the hardest I'd ever endured. Each interaction felt like a minefield. I struggled to act normal, all the while knowing that the woman sitting across from me at dinner was preparing to dismantle everything we'd built together. I'd catch her glancing at me with a look I couldn't quite place. Was it guilt? Regret? Or just her way of gauging whether I suspected anything? Greg's updates grew more alarming by the day. Samantha had rented a storage unit across town and was gradually moving items into it. Clothing, boxes, even some of our shared belongings. She's setting up a landing pad, Greg told me. It's pretty clear she plans to leave soon. Hearing this only solidified my resolve. I wasn't going to let Samantha blindside me. If she wanted to leave, fine, but I wouldn't let her take everything with her in the process. Laura had assured me that my proactive steps, moving assets, securing documents, and consulting her early, had given me a significant advantage. Still, the emotional toll of pretending everything was fine was wearing on me. One night, Samantha sat down beside me on the couch holding a glass of wine. "You've seemed stressed lately," she said, her voice soft. "Is everything okay?" For a moment, I felt like I was talking to the woman I'd married, the woman who used to know me better than anyone. But then I remembered the folder, the lies, and the meetings with Lila. Any tenderness I felt evaporated. "Just work," I replied, forcing a smile. "It's been hectic." She nodded, sipping her wine. "Let me know if there's anything I can do to help." The irony of her words nearly made me laugh. Help? The thought was absurd. Samantha wasn't helping. She was orchestrating the chaos. But I swallowed my anger and changed the subject, unwilling to let her see the cracks in my facade. The following morning, Greg called with what he described as the final piece of the puzzle. Samantha had scheduled a meeting with a realtor to list the house. She hadn't told me, of course. The appointment was set for later that week during a time she knew I'd be at work. "That's it," I said to Greg, my voice tight. "I can't keep pretending. She's crossed a line." Greg didn't try to talk me out of it. "If you're ready, then do it. Just make sure you have everything in order first." I spent the next 2 days preparing. I reviewed the paperwork Laura had given me, ensuring I had a clear understanding of my legal standing. I also made copies of the documents Samantha had tried to hide. By the time her meeting with the realtor rolled around, I felt as ready as I could be. That evening, as Samantha walked through the door, I was waiting for her in the living room. Her cheerful smile faltered when she saw me sitting there, my expression grim. "Hey," she said cautiously, "what's going on? We need to talk," I said, gesturing for her to sit down. She hesitated, her eyes darting to the stairs as if calculating whether she could make a quick escape. But then she sighed and sat down across from me, her posture stiff. "Okay," she said, "what's this about?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I know," I said simply. "About Lila, about the storage unit, about the house." Samantha's face went pale. For a moment, she didn't say anything, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for words. Finally, she managed, "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "I've seen the papers. I know you've been planning this for months." Her eyes filled with tears, but whether they were from guilt or frustration, I couldn't tell. "It's not what you think," she said weakly. "Then tell me what it is," I said, leaning forward. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been plotting to leave me while pretending everything was fine." Samantha didn't respond right away. She stared down at her hands, her shoulders slumped. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't know how to tell you," she said. "I've been unhappy for a long time, but I didn't want to hurt you." "Unhappy?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Then why didn't you talk to me? Why sneak around behind my back?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I thought it would be easier this way. I didn't want to fight. I just wanted a clean break." Her words stung, but they also filled me with a strange sense of clarity. Samantha hadn't just betrayed me, she'd underestimated me. She'd assumed I'd roll over and let her dictate the terms of our separation. But she was wrong. "Well, it's not going to be that easy," I said firmly. "If you want a clean break, fine. But you're not walking away with everything. I've already spoken to a lawyer and I've taken steps to protect myself." Samantha looked up at me, her expression a mixture of shock and betrayal. "You talked to a lawyer?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes," I said, "and I'm not sorry. You've been planning this for months, Samantha. Did you really think I wouldn't figure it out?" For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The air between us was thick with tension, years of shared memories and broken trust hanging in the balance. Finally, Samantha nodded, her face hardening. "If that's how you want to play it," she said, her voice cold, "then fine. Let's do this." The days following our confrontation were a blur of tense conversations and cold silences. Samantha moved into the guest room, a line drawn so clearly between us that it might as well have been carved into the floor. Every interaction was laced with bitterness and blame, the weight of her betrayal hanging over every word. I'd thought confronting her would bring some kind of closure, but it only left me with more questions. How long had she been unhappy? Was there someone else involved? Or was this purely a calculated move, an escape plan she'd been quietly constructing for months? Samantha offered no answers, retreating into herself as if shielding me from the truth would somehow make it hurt less. Meanwhile, I threw myself into preparing for the inevitable. Laura assured me that I was in a strong position, thanks to the steps I'd taken to protect my finances and document everything. "You've done the hard part," she said during one of our meetings. "Now it's just about sticking to the plan." But sticking to the plan was easier said than done. Each day felt like walking through a battlefield, navigating the debris of what our marriage had once been. Samantha and I avoided each other as much as possible, but when we did cross paths, the tension was palpable. Once I caught her staring at the wedding photo that still hung in the hallway, her expression unreadable. I wanted to ask her what she was thinking, but the words caught in my throat. What was the point? She'd made her decision, and no amount of reminiscing would change that. A week after our confrontation, Samantha made her move. I came home from work to find the house eerily quiet. Her car was gone, along with several of her belongings. The guest room was stripped bare, the bed neatly made as if she'd never been there at all. On the kitchen counter, I found a note in her handwriting. "I'm sorry it had to be this way. I'll have my lawyer contact yours. Take care." I stood there for a long time, staring at the note as a mix of emotions washed over me. Anger, sadness, relief. Part of me was furious that she hadn't had the decency to face me one last time, while another part was grateful that I didn't have to endure the awkwardness of her departure. Either way, it was done. She was gone, and our marriage was officially over. That night, I sat alone in the living room, a glass of whiskey in one hand and my phone in the other. I debated calling someone, Laura, Greg, even one of my friends, but the thought of explaining everything felt exhausting. Instead, I scrolled through old photos, reliving the memories that now felt tainted. our honeymoon in Hawaii, Christmas mornings spent unwrapping gifts by the fireplace, the silly selfies we'd taken on lazy Sunday afternoons. They all seemed like relics of a different life, one that no longer belonged to me. As the weeks passed, I began to adjust to my new reality. The house felt emptier without Samantha, but it also felt freer. I no longer had to tiptoe around her moods or second-guess her intentions. For the first time in months, I could breathe. Laura guided me through the legal process with precision, ensuring that Samantha couldn't take more than her fair share. Thanks to the evidence Greg had gathered, I was able to protect most of my assets, including the house. Samantha's lawyer made a few half-hearted attempts to contest certain points, but they didn't hold up under scrutiny. In the end, the settlement was fair, if not exactly amicable. Still, the emotional scars lingered. Some nights I'd lie awake, replaying everything in my mind. Was there something I could have done differently? A way to save our marriage before it fell apart? Or had we been doomed from the start, two people who were never meant to stay together? One evening, as I was cleaning out the attic, I came across a box of Samantha's belongings she'd left behind. Inside were old letters, photographs, and a journal she'd kept during our early years together. Curiosity got the better of me, and I flipped through the pages, skimming her thoughts and reflections. Most of it was light-hearted. Notes about our dates, musings about her job, lists of things she wanted to accomplish. But one entry stood out, written about a year before she started pulling away. I love him, but I feel like I'm losing myself. I don't know how to tell him without hurting him, but I can't shake this feeling that I'm trapped. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't an excuse for what she'd done, but it was an explanation, a glimpse into the cracks I hadn't seen at the time. I sat there for a long time, the journal resting in my lap, as I tried to reconcile the woman who'd written those words with the one who had lied and betrayed me. In the end, I decided to let it go. There was no point in dwelling on the past or trying to understand Samantha's choices. What mattered now was rebuilding my life, piece by piece, and learning to move forward. The months after Samantha left were both challenging and liberating. At first, I struggled to adjust to the silence that filled the house. The empty guest room, the missing coffee mug that used to sit on the counter, the absence of her laugh. All of it was a constant reminder of what I had lost. But as time passed, I began to see the emptiness as an opportunity rather than a void. I threw myself into projects around the house, tackling repairs I'd been putting off for years. I repainted the living room, replaced the squeaky cabinet doors, and finally put up the bookshelf I'd been meaning to build. It felt good to channel my energy into something tangible, something I could control. Greg's investigation and Laura's legal expertise had ensured that Samantha's departure didn't leave me financially ruined. I kept the house, most of our savings, and the retirement account we'd once shared. Samantha had tried to negotiate for more, but the evidence of her covert financial dealings worked in my favor. In the end, the court sided with me, and the settlement was finalized with little room for her to argue. One afternoon, as I was clearing out the last remnants of Samantha's things, I came across a photo of the two of us from our wedding day. We were smiling, arms wrapped around each other, looking every bit the happy couple. For a moment I considered throwing it away, but something stopped me. Instead, I tucked it into a box labeled Memories and placed it in the back of the attic. It wasn't that I wanted to cling to the past, but I didn't want to erase it either. Our marriage had been a part of my life, a chapter that shaped who I was. Even if it ended in betrayal, it wasn't all bad. As the weeks turned into months, I began to rediscover myself. For so long, I'd defined myself as part of a couple, prioritizing Samantha's needs and desires over my own. Now, for the first time in years, I could focus on what made me happy. I reconnected with old friends, picked up hobbies I'd abandoned, and even started going to the gym again. It was strange at first to carve out a life that didn't revolve around someone else, but it was also empowering. One evening, as I was sitting on the porch with a glass of whiskey, I realized something surprising. I didn't feel angry anymore. The bitterness, the resentment, the endless questions of why and what if, they'd all faded into the background. In their place was a sense of acceptance. Samantha had made her choices, and so had I. There was no going back, only forward. A few weeks later, I received a letter from Samantha. It was brief and to the point, an apology of sorts. She wrote about how she hadn't meant to hurt me, how she'd felt trapped, and hadn't known how to handle it. She admitted that her actions had been wrong, and thanked me for the years we'd shared. At the end she wrote, "I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me someday." I folded the letter and placed it in the same box as the wedding photo. Forgiveness wasn't something I could give easily, but I didn't need to carry the weight of anger either. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant freeing myself from the pain of holding on. The turning point came when a friend invited me to a weekend hiking trip. I hesitated at first, unsure if I was ready to jump back into socializing. But as we climbed the trails and camped under the stars, I felt a spark of something I hadn't experienced in months: joy. It wasn't the kind of happiness that comes from pretending everything is okay. It was raw, genuine, and rooted in the moment. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive. That trip marked the beginning of a new chapter. I started saying yes more. Yes to invitations, yes to new experiences, yes to the possibility of happiness. I wasn't naive enough to think that the road ahead would be easy, but I was ready to walk it, one step at a time. Looking back, I can't say I'm grateful for what happened. Samantha's betrayal was a wound I wouldn't wish on anyone. But I can say that I'm stronger because of it. I learned to trust myself, to stand my ground, and to rebuild when everything seemed lost. In the end, I found something I didn't know I'd been missing: myself. Story 6. I lost my wife to her gym obsession, and I'm picking up the pieces. My name's Mark, and I'm a 32-year-old guy trying to make sense of my marriage. My wife, Emma, is 30. We've been together for 7 years, married for 5, and for most of that time I thought we were a solid team. We had our ups and downs like any couple, but we always found a way to come back to each other. At least that's what I believed. Lately, though, it feels like I've been sharing my life with a stranger. Emma's growing obsession with the gym has created a wedge between us that I never saw coming. To be fair, Emma has always been active. Back in college, she worked out regularly at the campus gym. She loved the structure it gave her and the way it helped her blow off steam during stressful semesters. As her schedule got busier, she swapped those long gym sessions for runs outside or quick workouts at home. It was a healthy, balanced approach that I admired. She looked great, felt great, and we still had time to enjoy each other's company. But about 18 months ago, everything changed. Emma announced she was going to get back into the gym habit now that her job gave her more flexibility. At first, I was thrilled for her. I could see how much she missed having a consistent routine, and I wanted to support her. She seemed so excited, and I was happy to see her doing something that brought her joy. In the beginning, it was harmless. A couple of classes on weekends, a morning workout here and there, nothing out of the ordinary, but slowly her routine snowballed. What started as a few hours a week turned into daily visits. Before I knew it, she was heading to the gym twice a day, once in the morning and again after work. And if she ever missed a session, it was like the world was ending. Emma became irritable and short-tempered, like someone deprived of their fix. She'd pace around the house, snapping at me over the smallest things until she could head back to the gym. It didn't matter if it was raining, snowing, or if she was exhausted. The gym became her lifeline. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm all for staying fit. I know how important exercise is for both physical and mental health. But this wasn't just about staying healthy anymore. It felt like an escape, a way for her to avoid dealing with life's problems. Things took an even more complicated turn recently. Emma is 4 months pregnant with our first child. While I know it's generally safe for women to exercise during pregnancy, especially if they're already active, the intensity of her workouts hasn't let up. She's still pushing herself as hard as she did before, if not harder. Honestly, it feels like we barely had time to conceive with how much time she spends at the gym. And now, instead of cutting back or taking it easy, she's doubled down on her routine. It's like she's determined to prove something to herself or the world, though I have no idea what that could be. I've tried bringing up my concerns to her, carefully at first. I told her I missed spending time together and that I felt like the gym was taking over her life. She brushed it off, saying it was her way of staying sane, that it was her time to recharge. When I suggested we work out together, she laughed it off, telling me the gym was her space. What's worse is how her social circle has shifted. Emma's made all these new friends at the gym, people I barely know but who she seems to prioritize over everyone else. She's constantly chatting with them, planning events, and posting about their group on social media. Sometimes I feel like I'm competing for her attention with people who don't even know our anniversary date. And I know this isn't about me being insecure about her fitness or looks. I'm in good shape myself, my job requires it. But there's such a thing as overdoing it, and I genuinely believe Emma's gym habits have crossed that line. Even our friends and family have noticed the change. Her best friend mentioned how she barely sees her anymore, and someone even joked that Emma must be having an affair at the gym. I don't want to believe that, but when your wife spends more time there than at home, it's hard not to let your mind wander. So here I am, stuck in this limbo. I'm not sure how to fix this, or even if it can be fixed. But one thing's for sure. This doesn't feel normal, no matter how much Emma insists that it is. Emma's gym obsession didn't just impact our marriage, it started affecting her relationships with everyone around her. At first, her friends and family tried to be supportive, just like I did. They encouraged her, complimented her dedication, and even joined her for the occasional class. But as her commitment morphed into something more extreme, people began to pull back. Her best friend Molly confided in me a few weeks ago. "I barely see Emma anymore," she said, "and when I do, all she talks about is the gym. It's like she's forgotten there's a world outside of those four walls." Molly wasn't the only one who noticed. Emma's parents, who used to have her over for Sunday dinners, mentioned that she'd canceled on them more times in the past 6 months than in the last 5 years combined. "She always has some class or training she can't miss," her dad had said, shaking his head. But the worst part, at least for me, was how distant Emma became. It felt like she was using the gym as a shield, a way to avoid everything that made her uncomfortable or stressed. If we argued, she'd grab her bag and head out the door. If work was overwhelming, she'd drown her frustration in squats and cardio. Even moments that should have been joyful, like planning for the baby, felt overshadowed by her relentless routine. The pregnancy, as much as it should have brought us closer, only added to the strain. I know exercise is healthy for pregnant women, doctors encourage it, but Emma wasn't moderating her habits at all. She'd come home drenched in sweat, complaining about sore muscles and aching joints, but she refused to cut back. I suggested she talk to her OB/GYN about her workout intensity, hoping a medical opinion might make her reconsider. Instead, she rolled her eyes and said, "I know my body better than anyone. I'm fine." Her workouts weren't just physically demanding, they were relentless. 2 hours in the morning before work, another hour or two after. Weekends were spent in back-to-back classes, and if something threw her off schedule, like a family event or a meeting at work, it ruined her entire mood. She'd sulk, snap, or withdraw until she could get back to the gym. At one point, I started picking up the slack at home. It wasn't even a conversation, it just happened. If dinner needed to be made, I cooked. If the laundry piled up, I folded it. Grocery shopping? That was me too. I didn't mind helping out. Marriage is about teamwork, after all. But the balance was gone. I wasn't just helping, I was doing everything. And the more I took on, the more she seemed to pull away. One night, I decided to address it head-on. She had just come back from an evening session, her gym bag slung over her shoulder and her hair still damp from the shower. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a sink full of dishes I hadn't gotten to yet. "Emma," I started, trying to keep my tone steady. "We need to talk." She paused, her hand on the fridge door. "About what?" "About all of this," I said, gesturing around the kitchen. "The gym. The time you're spending there. The way it's taking over everything." Her brows furrowed, and I could tell she was already on the defensive. "The gym helps me, Mark. It keeps me grounded. I don't see what the problem is." "The problem," I said, leaning forward, is that you're not here anymore. Physically, yes, but mentally, emotionally, you're checked out." She sighed and crossed her arms. "That's not fair. I'm doing what I need to do to stay healthy, for me and for the baby." I wanted to believe her, but it didn't feel like the whole truth. "Healthy doesn't mean avoiding everything else in your life," I said quietly. "It doesn't mean ignoring your family, your friends, or me." For a moment she looked at me, really looked at me, and I thought maybe I'd gotten through. But then her expression hardened, and she shook her head. "You just don't get it," she muttered, grabbing a protein shake from the fridge and heading upstairs. It was like trying to hold water in my hands. No matter what I said or did, she kept slipping further away. To make matters worse, other people started planting seeds of doubt in my mind. A couple of friends joked that Emma was spending so much time at the gym, she must be training for a bodybuilding competition, or worse, meeting someone else. I laughed it off at first, but the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore. Every time her phone buzzed with a message from a gym buddy, or she mentioned another group hangout I wasn't invited to, that little voice in the back of my head got louder. Was this really just about exercise? Or was there something or someone else keeping her there? I didn't want to believe it. Emma had always been loyal, at least as far as I knew. But doubt has a way of creeping in, even when you don't want it to. And that doubt? It's starting to eat away at me, piece by piece. As Emma's gym habits spiraled further out of control, I started to feel like I was living with a ghost. She was physically present, but emotionally and mentally, she was somewhere else entirely, probably in the middle of a high-intensity interval class or chatting with her gym friends. It was hard not to take it personally. We used to share everything. Weekend brunches, lazy movie nights, even those mundane, quiet evenings when we'd just sit and talk about our day. Now, all of that felt like a distant memory. Whenever I tried to bring up how I was feeling, it was like I was hitting a brick wall. The first real confrontation came on a Friday night. I had been looking forward to us spending some time together, maybe going out to dinner or just staying in. Emma, as usual, had other plans. She breezed through the door, still in her workout clothes, her face glowing with the post-gym high that seemed to follow her everywhere these days. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "You're back later than usual." "There was a Zumba class after my session," she said, tossing her gym bag onto the couch. I couldn't resist. I bit back my frustration and forced a smile. I was hoping we could do something tonight. Just the two of us. Her expression faltered for a moment, but then she shrugged. "Mark, I'm exhausted. Can't we just relax? Maybe tomorrow?" Tomorrow never came. Every time I suggested something, whether it was dinner, a movie, or even just a walk, there was always a reason it couldn't happen. A few days later, I decided to push harder. "Emma, I need to talk to you," I said one evening after she got home. She looked at me warily, her hand pausing on the fridge door. "What now?" "This isn't working," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The way things are between us, it's not normal. You're at the gym all the time, and when you're home, it's like you're not even here." Her brows furrowed. "Mark, I've told you before, the gym is my outlet. It helps me deal with stress. Why can't you just be happy that I'm taking care of myself?" "Because it feels like you're taking care of yourself at the expense of everything else," I shot back, "at the expense of us." The conversation spiraled from there. Every time I tried to explain how her behavior was affecting me, she had a counter-argument. The gym was her sanctuary. She needed it for her mental health. I just didn't understand. Maybe she was right. I didn't understand. I didn't understand why she couldn't find balance, why she was choosing the gym over everything else in her life, or why she seemed so resistant to compromise. Around this time, people started offering their unsolicited opinions. Friends, co-workers, even family members, all of them had something to say. "I'm telling you, man," a buddy of mine said during a lunch break, "nobody spends that much time at the gym just to work out. Are you sure she's not seeing someone?" I laughed it off, but his words stuck with me. Even Emma's family wasn't blind to her behavior. At a family barbecue, her mom pulled me aside. "Mark, is everything okay with you two?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "We're fine," I lied. She gave me a knowing look. "Emma's different lately. She's so focused on the gym, she barely has time for anything else. I just hope she's not pushing herself too hard." I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything more. The tipping point came a week later. Emma had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she went upstairs to shower. Normally, I wouldn't have given it a second thought, but something about that day was different. Maybe it was the growing doubt, or maybe it was the way her gym friends had started to dominate her life. Whatever it was, I picked up her phone and swiped it open. Her messages were full of group chats and exchanges with her gym buddies, most of them harmless. But then I saw a name I recognized, a guy she mentioned a lot from the gym. Mike. Their conversation wasn't overtly romantic, but there was a familiarity there that made my stomach twist. They joked about inside stuff, things I didn't understand. He asked if she wanted to grab a post-workout smoothie, and she replied with a smiley face and, "Sure, you always know the best spots, the best." I put the phone down, my hands shaking. It wasn't concrete proof of anything, but it didn't feel right. That night I confronted her. "Emma, who's Mike?" I asked as casually as I could manage. She froze for a split second before answering. "He's just a friend from the gym. Why?" "I saw your messages," I admitted. "They seemed close." Her face hardened. "I can't believe you went through my phone," she said, her voice dripping with anger. "I didn't mean to—" Mike is just a friend," she snapped. "If you're insecure, that's on you, not me. I shouldn't have to defend my friendships just because you're feeling paranoid." The conversation ended there, but the tension between us was palpable. For the first time, I started to wonder if the life we'd built together was slipping away, if it already had. I wish I could say that the tension between Emma and me eased after that first confrontation, but it didn't. If anything, it got worse. She started guarding her phone more carefully, always keeping it close by or tucked into her gym bag. She wasn't secretive in an obvious way, Emma was smarter than that, but it was enough to make me suspicious. I tried to push the doubts out of my mind. I told myself I was overthinking it, that Emma's explanation about Mike being a friend was probably true. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. About a week later, I found myself alone in the house again. Emma had left for her usual evening gym session, and I was sitting on the couch, staring at the TV but barely registering what was on. My mind was elsewhere, replaying every odd interaction, every questionable moment from the past few months. That's when I noticed Emma's laptop on the coffee table. She must have forgotten to put it away before leaving. My heart started pounding, and for a few minutes, I just sat there, staring at it. I knew this was a line I shouldn't cross, but curiosity and doubt gnawed at me. Before I could stop myself, I opened the laptop. Emma had stayed logged into her email, and my eyes immediately scanned the subject lines. Most of them were mundane, work updates, gym class schedules, but then I saw a thread titled, "Great Workout Today." The email was from Mike. My stomach churned as I clicked it open. "Hey, Emma," the message began. "It was great seeing you today. I think you really crushed it in that class, no surprise there. By the way, you mentioned wanting to try that new protein shake recipe I told you about. I'll bring you a sample tomorrow. Let me know what you think." It wasn't outright inappropriate, but the casual tone, the winking emoji, the way he spoke to her like they shared some private world, it all made me feel sick. I scrolled through more messages between them. There were jokes, workout tips, and plans to meet for coffee or smoothies after the gym. Then I found one that made my blood run cold. "Thanks for last night," Mike had written. "I really needed that. You always know how to make everything better." Emma's reply was short. "You're welcome. It's what friends are for." What did he mean by last night? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they'd had a late workout or talked after class. But my mind wouldn't stop conjuring worst-case scenarios. When Emma came home that night, I was ready to burst. She walked through the door with her usual gym bag, her face flushed from her session, and gave me a quick "hey" before heading to the kitchen. "Emma, we need to talk," I said, standing up from the couch. She turned to look at me, her brow furrowed. What's going on? I found your emails, I said bluntly, between you and Mike. For a split second her expression froze. Then she crossed her arms, her face hardening. You went through my laptop? I did, I admitted, and I don't regret it. I needed answers, Emma. I needed to know what's been going on. There's nothing going on, she said, her voice tight. Mike is just a friend. Friends don't send messages like, thanks for last night, I shot back. What was he thanking you for? Her jaw tightened and she looked away. Mark, I'm not doing this with you, she said finally. I've told you before, Mike is a friend. That's it. If you can't trust me, that's your problem. No, Emma, I said, my voice rising. This is our problem. Your behavior, your secrecy, it's not normal. I've tried to talk to you about this, to make you see how your gym habits are affecting our marriage, but you keep shutting me out. And now I find these messages? How do you expect me to feel? She sighed, running a hand through her hair. Mark, I go to the gym because it makes me happy. Mike is part of that world. He's a nice guy who gets it. He understands how important this is to me. That's the problem, I said, my voice cracking. He gets more of you than I do. The gym gets more of you than I do. I'm your husband, Emma. Or have you forgotten that? For a moment she looked at me with something that almost resembled guilt. But then she shook her head. You're overreacting, she said. I'm not cheating on you, Mark. I shouldn't have to explain myself every time I make a friend or spend time doing something I love. Her words stung, but what hurt even more was the wall between us. It was like she'd already made up her mind, decided that her version of the truth was the only one that mattered. That night I lay awake in bed while Emma slept beside me. I kept replaying everything in my head, the emails, her defensiveness, the way she seemed more loyal to the gym than to our marriage. I didn't know what to do. All I knew was that the woman lying next to me felt like a stranger, and I wasn't sure if we could find our way back to each other. The days after our confrontation felt heavy, like a storm cloud had settled over the house and refused to budge. Emma and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was surface-level stuff, what we needed from the grocery store, whether the laundry was done, who would take the car in for servicing. The things we didn't say hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I couldn't stop replaying her words in my head. You're overreacting. I'm not cheating. This is your problem. Maybe she was telling the truth. Maybe I really was overthinking everything. But the pit in my stomach said otherwise, and I didn't know how to silence it. At work, I found myself zoning out during meetings, my mind drifting back to the emails, the gym, Mike. I kept asking myself the same questions over and over. What did he mean by last night? Was Emma telling the truth or was I being naive? And if she wasn't cheating, why did it feel like I was losing her anyway? I started avoiding social media altogether. Every time I opened my phone, it seemed like there was another post from Emma about the gym. Sweaty selfies, group photos, boomerangs of her lifting weights. She looked happy, glowing, like she was exactly where she wanted to be, and maybe she was. The problem was I wasn't part of that picture anymore. Even our friends noticed the change. Molly, her best friend, pulled me aside one evening when we ran into each other at the store. "How's everything going with you two?" she asked, her tone cautious. I hesitated. "It's complicated." She frowned. "You know, I love Emma, but she's been so distant lately. I barely see her anymore. It's like the gym is her whole world now." I nodded, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "Yeah, it feels that way for me too." "You've tried talking to her about it, right?" Molly asked. "Of course," I said. "But every time I bring it up, she just gets defensive. She says I'm the one with the problem." Molly sighed. "I don't know what's going on with her, but I hope you two can work it out. You're good together, Mark? Don't give up on her just yet." Her words stuck with me. I didn't want to give up on Emma, but how could I fight for someone who didn't seem to want to be fought for? That night, I tried one last time to reach her. She had just come home from the gym, her face flushed and her hair tied up in a messy bun. She looked tired, but not in a bad way. More like she'd just conquered a mountain and was basking in the satisfaction of it. "Emma," I said, stopping her in the hallway. "Can we talk?" She sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "Mark, I'm really tired. Can it wait?" "No," I said firmly. "It can't." She crossed her arms and leaned against the wall. "Fine. What is it?" "I need to know where we stand," I said, "because right now it feels like I'm losing you. And I don't know how to fix it." Her expression softened for a moment, and I thought maybe I was finally getting through. But then she shook her head. "You're not losing me, Mark," she said. "I'm still here. I'm just trying to figure things out. The gym helps me do that." "But at what cost?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Because it feels like the gym is more important to you than anything else, including us." "That's not fair," she said, her tone defensive. "You act like I'm doing something wrong just because I have something I'm passionate about." "It's not about passion," I said. "It's about balance. And right now, there's none. You're so focused on the gym that everything else is falling apart, and you don't even see it." She didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "I don't know what you want me to say, Mark. This is who I am right now. I'm sorry if that's not enough for you." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stood there staring at her, waiting for her to say something, anything that would make it better. But she didn't. She just turned and walked into the bedroom, leaving me standing in the hallway, feeling more alone than ever. That night I slept on the couch. It wasn't a decision we discussed, it just happened. The thought of lying next to her, pretending everything was fine, felt unbearable. Over the next few days I found myself questioning everything. Was I expecting too much from her? Was I being unfair? Or was I right to feel like this wasn't normal? I started thinking about our future, about the baby, about what kind of parents we'd be if things stayed the way they were. I didn't want to raise a child in a home full of tension and resentment, but I also didn't want to give up on the life Emma and I had built together. It felt like I was standing at a crossroads, and no matter which path I chose, I was going to lose something. The silence between Emma and me grew louder with each passing day. Every conversation felt forced, every glance heavy with unspoken words. I wanted to believe things would get better, but the reality was harder to ignore. We were drifting further apart, and neither of us seemed to know how to bridge the gap. Then came the breaking point. It was a Thursday evening, about 2 weeks after our last serious conversation. Emma had gone to the gym after work as usual, leaving me alone at home. I had started cooking dinner, a quiet effort to maintain some sense of normalcy. But as the hours passed and she didn't come back, my frustration bubbled over. I tried calling her. No answer. I texted her. Still nothing. By the time she finally walked through the door, it was almost 10 p.m., and I was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. "Hey," she said casually, setting her gym bag down by the door. "Sorry I'm late. Lost track of time." "Lost track of time?" I repeated, my voice sharper than I intended. "Emma, it's 10 o'clock. I've been trying to reach you for hours." Her brows furrowed. "I told you I had a long session tonight." "No, you didn't," I said, standing up. "You can't just disappear for hours and expect me not to worry. This isn't normal, Emma." She sighed and crossed her arms. "Mark, I'm fine. You don't need to worry about me." "But I do worry," I said, my voice rising. "Because you're not just my wife. You're the mother of our baby. And right now it feels like neither of those things matter to you as much as the gym does." Her face hardened. "That's not fair." "What's not fair," I shot back, "is how much you've shut me out. You've built this whole other life for yourself, and I'm not a part of it. Do you even care about what this is doing to us?" She stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she shook her head. "Mark, I can't keep having this same argument with you. I'm doing what I need to do to stay happy and healthy. If you can't accept that, I don't know what to tell you." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I realized then that no matter how much I tried, I couldn't force Emma to see things from my perspective. She had made her choice, and it wasn't me. That night I packed a bag and stayed at a friend's house. I didn't tell Emma where I was going, and for the first time in our marriage, I didn't feel guilty about it. Update. It's been a month since I left, and I wish I could say things have gotten easier. Emma and I are in the process of separating, though we've kept things civil for the baby's sake. She's still adamant that her gym habits aren't a problem, and I've stopped trying to convince her otherwise. The hardest part has been accepting that the person I fell in love with doesn't exist anymore. Or maybe she never did, and I just didn't see it. Either way, I know I made the right decision by walking away. I've started seeing a therapist, which has helped me process everything. I've also been leaning on my friends and family, who've been incredibly supportive. It's been humbling to realize how much I need them, especially now. As for Emma, I don't know what the future holds for her. Part of me hopes she'll come to her senses and realize what she's lost, but another part of me knows I can't wait around for that to happen. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that you can't force someone to change. All you can do is decide what you're willing to accept. And for me, that meant choosing my own happiness, even if it meant letting go of the life I thought we'd have together. I'm focusing on the baby now, on being the best dad I can be. It's not the future I envisioned, but it's one I'm determined to make the most of. To anyone reading this who's struggling with a similar situation, know that it's okay to choose yourself. It's okay to walk away from something that no longer serves you. It's not easy, but sometimes it's the only way to move forward.